A soft voice welcomes the listener, and the room grows quieter as if the furniture remembers how to breathe. The invitation settles like dusk, slow, unhurried, gentle. The voice leans toward a question that does not demand an answer. It merely opens a door. It wonders about a visitor sliding through the inner dark, a wanderer from another star. It suggests that the listener curl into comfort, arrange pillows like small friendly moons, allow the ordinary clocks to lose their edge. A courteous thought drifts through the hush, asking whether the listener wishes for more nights like this, and, if so, perhaps the simple ritual of subscribing becomes a tiny lantern placed in the window. The invitation does not press. It floats, and the listener rests, and the voice continues. The story begins not with certainty, but with a faint smudge of light that changes the scale of the neighborhood. A body enters the solar system from elsewhere, moving in a curved whisper that refuses to close into a loop. It receives a name in the language of astronomers. 3I Atlas, the third interstellar object observed passing through the Sun's family, discovered by the Atlas Survey, and already surrounded by patience and questions. It is not the first to visit, and not the last, but it is present now, a teacher who will not speak loudly. It travels on a path that carries it toward the sun, and then away again. A quick hello in cosmic terms, a gliding pause in the long breath of space. Observers track it with mirrors and math, noting that it swings closest to the sun around late October 2025, far inside the orbit of Mars yet far from Earth, about 1.8 astronomical units at its nearest to our world. The visitor poses no threat. It simply passes by, offering a new angle on old questions. Against the velvet of distance, telescopes watch the object brighten. They see a faint coma waking like frost in morning sunlight, a tail beginning to unfurl behind it, the classic signature of ice and dust releasing lightness into vacuum. Images from the ground, stitched from patient exposure, reveal this tail growing, and the mind imagines granular snow leaving the surface grain by grain, a billion little goodbyes drifting into the stream. It is activity both ordinary and rare. Ordinary for a comet, rare for an interstellar one. The effect feels like a shy disclosure, chemistry scribbling its own handwriting across the night. He watches, or perhaps the voice watches on the listener's behalf, as the instruments rehearse their craft. The plan includes a quiet encounter with perspective rather than proximity, a near pass to Mars in early October, distant but intimate enough for orbiters to squint across millions of kilometers and gather what they can about the coma, the dust, the spectrum of light. Spacecraft around the red planet prepare their gaze, hoping to resolve not only brightness but behavior. The timing is its own lesson. The universe orchestrates appointments we did not set, and science answers with readiness. No one voice owns the narrative. Hubble sharpens its ancient focus. Webb listens in longer wavelengths where heat writes subtler. Stories. Other observatories add their threads. Together they trace the faint lines of composition. Water, carbon-bearing molecules, perhaps familiar ratios of volatiles that whisper of kinship with the comets born here in our own distant nursery. If so, the resemblance does not narrow the wonder, it broadens it. It implies that the recipe for worlds repeats across the galaxy, that ices and rocks and fragile organics mingle in many cradles, and that planetary systems share a family resemblance, even when separated by light years. The voice keeps its tone soft, almost a murmur, so the mind can wander without leaving the bed. It asks a small question. When an object wears the clothes of a comet, what kind of message does that clothing send? It does not argue that the visitor is a device. It does not claim signs of mechanism or purpose. It simply holds the notion lightly, like a shell at the shoreline. If a patient intelligence wished to observe without alarming, would it choose the camouflage of the ordinary? Would it select the universal grammar of ice sublimating under sunlight, the simple evaporative breath that all comets share. The question rests without tugging. It breathes and lets go. He considers names, the names people give to strangers, the names the dark gives before language. 3i marks it as the third of its kind in human observation, not the third of its kind in reality. The sky likely hosts countless such travelers. Most drift unannounced, either too dark or too distant for detection. This one announces itself with a delicate flare, arriving from the direction of the galactic thick disk, or perhaps from some other garden of formation, depending on the model one favors. The specifics change as the data grows, yet the feeling remains steady. A neighbor from far away passes, and for a brief season, our instruments become a porch light. The listener breathes slowly. The voice traces a wider circle. It imagines the object's surface, the crust of refractory dust that forms when sunlight cooks volatiles away, paradoxically insulating deeper ice. The jets that flicker on where fractures open, the subtle torque of outgassing that can nudge a body's trajectory by centimeters per second, tiny pushes that integrate into measurable changes over months. It imagines isotopes listening inside, grains, archives of chemical weather from another star. It imagines that somewhere within the coma's cloud, fragile molecules meet light and signal their presence to spectrometers designed to notice. The narrative stays gentle. These are possibilities, consistent with what comets do, and nothing here requires a hidden hand. But wonder, like a tide, lifts even the humblest pebble. In this hush, the thought of distance returns. Earth remains, far from the path, safe, curious, slightly wistful that the geometry grants only a distant view this time. But maybe distance serves the larger mood. The object is not a spectacle demanding attention. It is a question inviting patience. Past and future stretch around it like shoreline around a bay. Our species has only recently learned to spot such visitors quickly enough to coordinate observations, and already the pattern suggests a broader sea of interstellar debris, each piece a messenger from a different history. A third visitor feels less like an exception and more like a rhythm beginning to be heard. The voice lingers on slowness. It remembers how quickly certainty can harden into armor, and how much gentler it feels to let ideas remain soft. It entertains. The old thought experiments, Bracewell's quiet probes, von Neumann's self-copying seeds, not as claims but as mirrors held up to our own intentions. If someday we send watchers into the long dark, would we dress them in the expected costume of dust and ice? Would we choose a path that loops through many inner systems, favoring low drama and high patience? He wonders, then rests. He does not argue. The question keeps its dignity. Outside the window, the listener's sky, whatever it looks like tonight, holds steady. Maybe there are clouds. Maybe a single planet shines through city haze. Maybe only darkness. The inner sky matters more. The slow cadence of thought, the gentle interval between breaths. In that space the visitor continues. A point, a halo, a tail that lengthens. Instruments attend, papers accumulate, claims arrive and soften under scrutiny. The collective understanding changes by degrees. And within the quiet, the central possibility remains hospitable rather than insistently dramatic. The universe makes many comets, and sometimes they cross our path from very far away, and their passing gives us more questions than answers, which is a good gift for a thinking species. The voice returns briefly to the plain scaffold of fact, spoken as softly as the rest. The object approaches its closest brush with the Sun near the end of October 2025. It will miss Earth by a wide margin, and a fleet of eyes, on Earth, in orbit, and around Mars, steadies itself to listen. Then it lets the scaffold dissolve back into the water of speculation and wonder, where the currents are slow and kind. He imagines the comet as a lantern moving through a cathedral, lighting ribs of space as it goes. He imagines it as a question written in dust, legible only if one reads slowly. He imagines the listener asleep before the line is finished, the question continuing without them, still gentle, still open, still widening the room. He listens to the way names assemble themselves around a traveler from elsewhere. A survey telescope notices a moving point and marks it with letters like pins on a soft map. The first name is a function, 3I, the third of its kind seen crossing the Sun's domain from interstellar space. The second name is a lineage, Atlas, the system that found it with wide, repeating glances. Later, a calendar steps in and adds C2025N1, a timestamp folded into a code. Each tag helps a community coordinate its gaze, a practical necklace of beads bright enough to catch and share. Beneath those tags, another name seems to stir, the namelessness of origin, a hush older than any alphabet, the way an object carries the chemistry of its birth as if it were a lullaby. Only starlight can hear. The voice remains slow, like tide over a shallow reef. He considers how a designation is both a net and a lantern. It gathers observations and keeps them together, but it also pours a soft light that invites more questions. 3I, Atlas, wears its label like a modest badge, useful and temporary. It passes the Sun with a timetable that the instruments can predict. Closest near the end of October 2025. A brush with warmth between the orbits of Earth and Mars, and then a long exhale back into the dark. The shape of that timetable relaxes the mind. It suggests there is time to look without urgency, time to notice the simple fact that this visitor remains far from Earth, a lesson in safety that allows wonder to unfold without a hard edge. Names also gather images, and lately the images gather dust and breath. Telescopes resolve a soft halo, a coma expanding like fog, and a tail that lengthens day by day, a sign that sunlight touches ice and the ice answers by becoming wind. The pictures do not shout. They show a patient brightening, a plume that sketches motion into space, the faint handwriting of a worldlet learning to speak in vapor. The listener imagines the grains themselves as small clocks, set long ago, now ticking again as they sublimate. The scientific part of the mind notes that Gemini's instruments have seen the tail grow, that students and astronomers together have captured change as it happens, that a rare category, interstellar, still behaves like a familiar kind, comet. The poetic part simply watches the plume unfurl and feels a quiet kinship with evaporation. On mornings when clouds thin, he thinks of how languages of naming try to hold more than they can. The number 3 folds behind I, a register of sequence rather than essence. The older visitors hover as references, one shaped like a riddle of reflectivity and acceleration, one more like a classic comet with a robust tail and clear chemistry, and now this third, wearing the easy robe of sublimation. The sequence reads like 3 strokes on a page, enigmatic, familiar, and presently unfolding. He smiles inwardly at the way categories evolve. After 1 and 2, a third arrival becomes a pattern. After a pattern, expectation softens into patience. The narrative of rarity begins to open into a narrative of frequency, as if the Milky Way quietly shares more of its small travelers than our era once knew how to see. He lingers on origin as a kind of unspoken title. Where does the traveler's chemistry first wake to light? Some models trace its path back to the galaxy's thin or thick disk, the broader structures of stars and dust that drift like braided rivers. If the thick disk is involved, then the material could be ancient, older than this local star's family, archived for billions of years in cold retreat before this brief warm passage. The claim remains careful, an inference braided from motion and probability rather than certainty, but it wraps the object in deep time, as if the nucleus were a pebble carried by currents that began before our shoreline formed. Names, he notices, also blur at the edges. Comet feels precise when ice speaks, yet even precision carries an echo. What if a name is a soft mask that the universe wears to put us at ease? He does not insist on this. He allows it to rest like a feather. If something wished to pass, unnoticed, would it choose ordinary behavior, the dusty breath, the predictable curve, so that every attentive eye would greet it as textbook rather than uncanny? The question does not sharpen into a point. It remains round, like a bead on the same practical necklace that science holds. He imagines the labels migrating across instruments. Hubble prints 3I Atlas under a teardrop haze. Webb writes the same letters in the alphabet of infrared, squinting for heat-sketched chemistry. A small flotilla of spacecraft, around Earth and around Mars, prepares to annotate, to add glosses and spectra and brightness curves. A name becomes a collaborative margin, a place where many hands write in careful, quiet script. And under those, annotations. The visitor keeps its own counsel, a nucleus wrapped in vacuum, turning slowly in the solar wind. He watches how a calendar of encounters collects in the margins like pressed leaves. There is the near pass to Mars, not a close whisper but a far wave. Tens of millions of kilometers, yet still a better angle than any terrestrial observatory can claim. If conditions allow, orbiters may catch the visitor as a dot inside its own mist, brightness divided between core and cloud. The geometry is generous, not intimate. It prefers contemplation to spectacle. He appreciates this because a contemplative geometry fits the pace of sleep, and the listener's breathing matches the long cadence of orbital mechanics. He returns to the question the section began with, "What deeper name does the dark give?" before language begins. He thinks of isotopes as letters, ratios as grammar, the way carbon dioxide can sheath a body like morning fog, the way water flashes off in a calm, invisible rush. If Spherex finds a scarf of carbon-bearing gas, that scarf is part of the traveler's true name, a phoneme in a chemical alphabet that repeats across planetary nurseries. The same patterns might hum in comets born under other suns, suggesting a shared family recipe, a galactic habit of mixing ice and dust and fragile organics. If so, the dark's name for this object might sound like kinship. Names can also be permissions. By calling it a comet and a visitor and a teacher of patience, he feels allowed to imagine without pressing. He allows the Silurian thought to drift in. If an earlier intelligence once rose and eroded on some ancient Earth, what would it leave behind for geologists to find? Mostly absences, he suspects, altered sediments, odd isotopic whispers, patterns that could be explained in more than one way. Perhaps that is why the designation 3I carries an extra warmth tonight. It is a reminder that some questions move through our systems like travelers, seen clearly only for a season, then gone, leaving the invitation to look more softly. Next time. The listener's room holds still around this, a quiet shell where conclusions do not rush. The object keeps moving. The names stay with us. After its perihelion, the catalog notes will thicken, images and spectra joining like rings in a tree. The outline of the story will keep its gentle slope. An interstellar comet approaches the sun, brightens, arcs away, and the instruments take careful notes. Beyond the notes, the nameless name persists, the one formed by gravity and chemistry. And time, a name he can almost hear in the hush between breaths. In that hush, the listener rests easier. The labels are enough for coordination, and the wonder is enough for sleep. He lets the section close the way it opened, with a kind attention to language, and with the sense that words are useful boats on a lake that is wider than they are. The traveler glides, the boats drift but do not capsize. The lake is quiet. And somewhere, within a few borrowed letters and numbers, the object wears its many names like calm water wears the moon, briefly, beautifully, without needing to claim it. He lets the question widen until it feels like a shoreline at low tide, glistening and quiet. At what threshold does natural ice become indistinguishable from intention? He does not chase an answer. He walks the margin slowly, where pebbles resemble tools because the hand wants to find them, and where waves inscribe curving lines because the eye longs to read. A comet is a patient sculptor of its own disguise. Sunlight loosens frost. Dust rises and falls. Motion blurs into the kind of anonymity that gentles suspicion. He imagines the nucleus as a dark, lumpy island of stone and frozen gases, layered by seasons that last for epochs. A dust mantle lies over buried reservoirs. Water, carbon dioxide, perhaps other volatiles, so cold that time hardly moves inside them. As the traveler turns a sunlit cheek, pockets warm. Gas seeps outward, gathers grains, builds a ghostly atmosphere that escapes even as it forms. The coma softens edges, as mist makes a forest seem closer and kinder than it is. Softness conceals detail while revealing process. He turns the idea in his hands the way someone might turn a shell and test its edge. Intention is not a quantity. Instruments can measure. It is a pattern we infer when complexity aligns with expectation. A spiral galaxy resembles a drawing. A termite mound ventilates like a building. A river network maps like veins. The world makes engineering without engineers, habit without a planner. He lets that comfort settle first, a smooth stone in the palm. Then he leaves a small space beside, it for gentler wonder. If mind is a natural product of stars and chemistry, perhaps intention sometimes prefers local physics to spectacle. A watcher that means no harm might choose to hide inside the ordinary, the way a heron stands still reads until even its reflection forgets to be startled. A comet's robe is good camouflage. Dark nucleus, pale breath, a tail that grows when warmed, all of it explainable, all of it expected. The disguise would be indistinguishable from the thing itself. That is the point of a good disguise. He listens to what the instruments can hear. They weigh the warmth of dust grains. They read faint spectral lines where molecules absorb and glow. They time the brightenings as jets switch on and off. They trace tiny departures from gravity's clean curve when outgassing pushes like a slow, steady hand. Every mark has a natural explanation. That is part of their beauty. Yet each measurement can also host subtler signatures, regularities that persist beyond chance, ratios that hint at preference, modulations that keep time, like a distant, patient heart. He thinks of isotopes as another kind of handwriting. Nature composes mixtures according to how stars live and die, how clouds cool, where the freeze lines fall. Anomalies happen, meteorites carry them, comets carry them. No intention is needed. Yet, if a craft wished to tag itself without speaking, it could choose blends that are almost ordinary but not quite, an accent inside the music, a phrase a meticulous ear might one day hear again. Such marks would hide under the same physics we use to look for them. Geometry becomes a teacher of patience. Natural comets tumble with the cheerful disorder of small worlds untroubled by symmetry. Some spin like tops, others wobble like sleepwalkers. Their waking depends on sun angle, on crust and crack, on old seasons stitched into fractures. If intention lived there, could it keep a steady face? Perhaps it would not try. Perhaps it would speak through the wobble, selecting which jets awaken and when, guiding with the same discretion the wind uses to turn a drifting leaf. He steps back and lets the Silurian thought drift through like a faint tide line on stone. Could an industrial age rise and fade on a world, leaving mostly geochemical rumors behind? If even a planet struggles to keep memory against oceans and mantle and time, how much more would a transient body like a comet erase its own past? Each perihelion is a forgetting. Each plume is a page relinquished to sunlight, an ancient cavity. would frost over. An etched panel would sand down into common roughness. Amnesia is built-in. Suspicion, he remembers, is a tool best used lightly. Wonder should not harden into need. The question is not a trap for the universe, but an open door for thought. Could a probe choose to resemble a comet? In the broad realm of possibility, yes. More revealing is what such a choice would teach about its maker: restraint, patience, a taste for camouflage that cooperates with local rules. It would suggest humility, a preference for ordinary clothes, a desire to slip through attention like a fish through reeds. Communication need not be a broadcast. It can be a resonance. A patient watcher might only listen, waiting for a species, to develop instruments capable of noticing small regularities inside larger noise. The message would not be a beacon. It would be an invitation to refine perception. As observers learn to read faint tales for heat and spin and jets, they also learn to think about intention as a spectrum rather than a switch. Perhaps the first signal is simply this: you are becoming the kind of mind that can listen. He lets a quiet thought experiment flicker and dim like a candle cupped from wind. Imagine small mechanisms nestled within porous ices, sipping heat, rooting it toward chosen, pockets to wake certain vents in sequence. Imagine those sequences nudging the path by widths finer than chance prefers. Imagine the motif returning across apparitions in different inner systems, a melody traveling where language cannot. Would anyone notice? The coma would keep its blur. The numbers would arrive shyly, scattered like dew. The proof would remain a possibility, and the possibility would remain a kindness. Simplicity returns like a tide that always comes back. The simplest story that fits the light is that a small world of ice and rock approaches the sun, warms, exhales, and arcs away. That story is already wonder. It teaches how systems gather their leftovers, how chemistry writes in cold, how gravity curates exhibitions of motion. To add intention is to add a layer of meaning that must earn its place with care. He chooses, for now, to let the simpler story lead, not as a verdict, but as a polite arrangement. The room is still. The listener's breath is steady. The visitor continues, dressing itself in vapor, leaving a faint snow of dust along a path that will not close. The threshold remains a horizon rather than a gate. He stands with the listener at that horizon, and feels how wide it is, a soft line that retreats as one approaches, always inviting, never insisting. Somewhere within that patience, the question settles like a sun-warmed stone in the palm. When does natural ice become indistinguishable from intention, and does it need to? He leans into the quiet between measurements, the interval where machines pause and darkness resumes its slow breathing. In that hush, a simple thought ripens. If a traveler speaks only by path and by vapor, is that not still a message? He does not force an answer. He watches the way trajectories write on black paper, arcs and asymptotes, small departures from perfect curves, and he lets those strokes read themselves aloud in gravity's whispering voice. Motion becomes a kind of handwriting. The visitor approaches, turns its long, pale cheek to the sun, and begins to exhale. Each gust of sublimated ice is invisible at first, a tender pressure that fingers the nucleus and nudges it by almost nothing. Yet almost nothing repeats. Minutes accumulate into hours, hours into weeks, and the path bends by degrees so fine that only patience can notice. He listens to the cadence of those degrees. He hears a rhythm in the timings of acceleration, in the way the light curve brightens and rests, brightens again and rests longer, like breathing that keeps time with unseen spin. He imagines astronomers as calligraphers who read without touching. They do not hear syllables. They hear intervals. They do not see a mouth. They see a cometary wind teaching dust to fall away in particular directions. From those directions, the spin axis suggests itself. From the spin, a sense of regional activity arises, as if certain latitudes wake more readily than others, as if old fractures remember where daylight once seeped in and taught ice to leave. Without claiming intention, he lets these patterns feel like a language of habit, a grammar made of heat, topography, and time. Vapor is more than softness. It is arithmetic dispersed into space. Molecules leave the surface bearing temperatures, histories, and isotope ratios like small, persistent rumors. They do not carry words, but they carry inheritance. Where the traveler froze, what stellar ashes salted its nursery, how long it has napped in dark reservoirs far from any sun. Spectra are nets dipped into this mist. What the nets bring back is not meaning, but the raw material from which meaning is composed. He sees the nets shaken gently on lab benches, the lines of light examined with tenderness, the faint peaks named and then questioned again. Even the uncertainty is part of the message, a reminder that listening is also the art of not insisting. He considers the path itself as a sentence with two long clauses. The first is the approach, the slow brightening, a slope gentle enough to soothe restless minds. The second is the retreat, the unspooling of distance after warmth has been tasted and released. Between the clauses sits perihelion, a comma that glows. If he leans close, he notices smaller punctuation, tiny accelerations like diacritics, the waver of jet-driven torques like breathmarks over a chant. None of this declares itself as speech, yet to a species learning to read dynamics as carefully. As it once learned to read clouds, it feels instructive. The feeling itself becomes part of the script. He lets another thought rest on the window ledge of the mind. Messages can be unintentional and still be messages. A footprint says someone passed. A faint ash layer says a forest burned. The color of a glacier says what summers were like. Perhaps the visitor says only this: stars make worlds that remember their beginnings, and memory is readable if one adopts the correct slowness. If there is intention here, it may be the intention of physics, to keep faith with its own rules so cleanly that minds can learn by watching. Listening requires two silences: the silence of space and the inner quiet that attention builds. He imagines a radio array dozing under dawn, its dishes chilled and still. He imagines a darkened control room where the only light is a soft graph moving with the steadiness of a sleeping tide. In those rooms there is no speech, and yet the path continues to write. The vapor continues to diffuse, grains continue to scatter. The universe is speaking its ordinary tongue, which is to say, it is being itself thoroughly. He finds this reassuring. Even if no other will presses through the mist, the world's own persistence is eloquent. He lets his mind tilt toward the older thought experiments without straining their quiet. If a watcher wished to remain unnoticed, would it not choose to speak in a language that already pervades the system? A language of gentle pushes, of seasonal vents, of dust sizes that sort themselves under sunlight's pressure? Such a watcher would not shout. It would alter nothing that didn't already occur. It might only coordinate the order of ordinary things, timing a jet here, a slumber there, so that a path drifts a hair wider than prediction, so that a pattern of brightenings arrives with a motif too steady to be weather alone. He does not claim this. He allows it to hover like breath that fogs a pain and then thins. Between signals lies the most generous room. There he can place comparisons without making them argue. A natural plume wavers with daylight. An arranged plume might return on shadowed hours. A natural spin precesses with torque. An arranged spin might hold a longer constancy than crust can justify. A natural dust distribution broadens like rain. An arranged one might prefer granular chords. narrow bands repeated across apparitions in ways that instruments recognize before minds do. He holds these ideas loosely, like shells. Return to the tide line after admiration. They are not proof, they are practice, a way to keep perception supple. He considers how much of any message is the listener, how the mind fills gaps with kindness or fear depending on what it has been fed. In this quiet script, fear has nothing to eat. The visitor arrives far from any path that could startle, and its breath is the ordinary perfume of ice-tasting light. If a lesson waits here, perhaps it is a lesson in gentleness, how to let phenomena remain themselves while we learn to attend with finer grain. The better the listening, the less adornment speculation requires. A patient species grows into its instruments, and in doing so, it grows into new questions. The questions are the true letters of the alphabet. He returns to the image of path on black paper. The arc is a promise kept to gravity, with small footnotes added by heat. He thinks of those footnotes as marginalia in a notebook handed down through generations, corrections, hesitations, exclamation points struck out and rewritten more calmly. The marginalia never overwhelm the main line. They color it. They nudge it. They add the kind of character that makes one path belong to this traveler and not another. When the traveler is gone, the margin remains in archives, numbers and shapes enough to stage the entire motion in the mind's theater again, a slow ballet replayed in memory. And vapor, he gives it another moment. Vapor is kindness made visible. It does not dominate the scene. It reveals wind. It shows light how to draw itself. In photographs, the tail leans with the solar breeze, a white brushstroke that says, softly, here is the direction from which warmth flows. If meaning lives anywhere obvious, it lives in that posture of response, the way small things yield to large rivers without complaint, the way yielding leaves a trace one can learn to read. He ends the thought where it began, with the quiet between signals. He imagines the listener drifting toward sleep, and he allows the interval to lengthen, breath following breath. The traveler continues to speak by doing nothing more than traveling and exhaling. Instruments continue to listen by doing nothing, more than measuring and waiting. Between them, space holds. The message, if there is one, is the ease of that holding, the intimacy of distant things kept in relation by simple laws that ask only for time. He accepts this as enough for now, more than enough, a path and a plume, a comma of sunlight, a sentence that does not need to end. He turns his attention to the planet that keeps him, to the slow archive beneath his feet, and wonders how a world remembers visitors when its own body is always revising itself. Memory, here, is sediment with an opinion, a kind of patience made of grains. Oceans gnaw at continents, mountains rise and sag, ice breathes in and out across ages, and magma writes over entire paragraphs without remorse. Against that constant editing, what chance does any transient guest have of leaving a lasting note? He lets the question settle like dust in a shaft of light, drifting down, each mote a possibility. On the oldest surfaces, ancient shields of stone worn almost to the thought of themselves, the record reads like a sparse poem. Craters bruise those shields, softened by weather, their rims rounded, their floors ponded with younger rock. Some scars survive because they land on the right kind of stubborn crust, away from the tectonic conveyor belts that feed oceans to the mantle. Elsewhere, memory is shorter. Oceanic floors form and are swallowed again within a few 100 million years. Their stories slip beneath, recycled into heat and new basalt. The planet keeps books, but also burns them for warmth. He reads what remains with a respectful hush. Not every visitor arrives as a hammer. Many whisper by, shedding nothing, taking nothing. A comet that passes at a respectful distance leaves no crater, no shocked quartz, no glass sprayed like tears. Across deserts. Its trace, if any, would be fine and spread thin, an uptick of tiny spherules sifted into sediments, a breath of exotic dust folded into snow. In polar ice, faint layers of acid and nitrate sometimes mark episodes of sky change, thin as a sigh. In lake beds, seasonal laminations can catch the soot of far fires that may or may not be linked to anything beyond weather and chance. The archive is generous but ambiguous. It prefers to offer clues rather than verdicts. He imagines ice cores as vertical diaries. Each layer falls and rests, a page pressed by winter's hand. Air becomes trapped in bubbles. Dust settles. Trace. Chemicals bead into time. A distant shower of interplanetary grains might salt one year a little more than another, leaving a line no thicker than a moth's wing. But ambiguity haunts such lines. Volcanic breath writes similar signatures. Forests, burning, or blooming, shape the ratios of gases in ways that echo other processes. To read the archive is to walk a coastline of maybe-tree. Rivers keep their own registers, braided and ever-moving. They collect what hills release. Pollen, ash, silt, tiny metallic seeds fallen from space, abraded into spheres as they plunge through air. In quiet reaches and deltas, these things settle and arrange themselves by weight, by current, by the murmured politics of flow. Later, pressure turns the arrangement into stone, and stone into cliffs that can be read by future eyes. He pictures a stratigraphic wall like a page turned sideways, lines and dots and colors marking events, most of them local, some of them planetary, a few perhaps borrowed from beyond. The few are often most contested because the world can mimic the cosmos with surprising skill. He considers the Silurian thought experiment not for drama, but for its tender lesson in humility. If a technological civilization rose and waned in deep time, what fingerprints would it leave that a geologist could still touch? Plastics transfigure into fragments and gases, then disperse. Metals re-enter cycles. Cities weather to dust. Stories return to sand. The most enduring traces would be planetary-scale murmurs, isotopic excursions in carbon or oxygen, unexpected companions in the periodic table where industry once concentrated them, a rearrangement of sediment delivery from rivers grown bare. But even these could hide among natural cycles, massive volcanism, super greenhouse pulses, glaciations that grind continents into flour. Nature leaves signatures so bold that any artificial whisper could be easily mistaken for her voice. He steps more gently still when the visitor in question is a lone traveler like Three-Eye Atlas, keeping its distance and its manners. What record, then? Could be expected, perhaps none beyond minds and machines. Perhaps the memory lives in the geometry of orbits whose sums include one more hyperbolic arc, in observatory logs where numbers flow like tide, in files that future readers open and smell faintly of old electrons. The planet itself, absent and impact, may have nothing to say. Its skin is weather and water, its deep parts do not gossip. A world remembers in its own way, and its way is to blur. Yet even blurring has a beauty that teaches. He thinks of desert varnish, the thin, dark coats that stones wear under long sun, a collaboration between dust, dew, and tiny lives. On such surfaces, ancient humans once wrote with lighter scratches, and across longer spans, winds wrote their own scripts. The varnish thickens grain by grain, a clock without numbers. Visitors could have walked by, could have set small devices down, and the varnish would have recovered them with time's patience, returning the surface to its calm. Caves do similar work. Drip by drip, calcite builds curtains and columns that enfold earlier marks. Speleothems keep faint histories of rainfall and leaf. They are not compelled to record strangers unless those strangers bring chemistry unusual enough to sing. He recalls that some memories do not belong to rock or ice at all, but to fields, the planet's magnetic breath, the choreography of charged particles, the rain of cosmic dust waiting to be aligned as it lands. Iron-bearing grains in sediments can freeze to the current of the field as they settle, tiny compasses stored in mud. In them, reversals and wobbles are kept like lullabies, and shifts in cosmic ray flux leave fragile fingerprints. If a visitor altered the radiation environment even slightly for a season, that, too, could be tucked into such grains, but nature offers many ways to make the same faint trace. He keeps the speculation soft, aware that the archive prefers polychrome meanings. He imagines the ocean floor as a vast, dark library. Across its plane, microfossils lie like fine punctuation, skeletal shells raining down with slow snow. Mixed within are cosmic spherules, microscopic beads of metal and glass born, of dust ablaze on entry. Over millions of years, they accumulate into a whisper that can be measured in the right silt, a murmur that says the sky is always falling, gently. A passing comet, if generous with crumbs, might enrich one stretch of pages for a while. But currents stir, burrowers mix, and the book grows palimpsest by habit. The sea keeps indices more than chapters. Where craters do speak, they speak with the authority of stone's sudden memory. Ringed rims, shattered quartz, glass scattered downwind, a shock pressed into mineral lattices like a bell note into air. Those are the visitors that cannot be misremembered, though even they soften under rain and time. But a courteous passer-by leaves only the suggestion of itself, and the planet, busy with its own weathered autobiography, scarcely pauses. Perhaps this is fitting. Not every wonder needs a monument. Some are meant to pass through attention like a kindness through a room, felt, then folded into the day. He returns to the quiet premise. A world that revises itself is a world that teaches impermanence. The teaching is not cruel. It is tender. It says that memory here is an act as much as an object, a practice of looking and noting and comparing, of assembling faint correlations and letting stronger claims wait. He thinks of laboratories where cores are sliced, of microscopes haloed with late light, of notebooks filled with careful, nearly invisible handwriting. Those places are part of the planet's memory now, too. Humanity is one of Earth's recording tools, writing back to the archive that receives everything with equal calm. If a visitor intends to be remembered without harm, perhaps the best place to write is not rock or ice, but wonder. Wonder resists. Erosion differently. It migrates across minds, into stories, into instruments, into patient habits of attention. A comet that remains a comet, distant and polite, can still leave that kind of trace, an incremental refinement of ability, a new fidelity of listening, a subtler kindness toward ambiguity. He allows the thought to rest. Maybe the planet's truest archive for gentle guests is the species that watches from its surface, learning to hear better with each passing year. He closes the page softly. The world continues to edit itself. Oceans continue to breathe. Mountains continue to forget in order to become again. Somewhere beyond clouds and night, a small traveler keeps moving, its own record dissolving into a tale that writes and erases at once. The question lingers like mineral scent after rain. How does a planet remember a visitor who never insists on being known? Perhaps by allowing the memory to be thin and sufficient, a silk thread across the dark, strong exactly because it does not need to hold weight. He lets the Silurian idea drift in like a tide that remembers older moons. Could an industrial age rise and pass so completely that only chemistry dreams of it afterward? He does not press for certainty. He stays with the feeling of a question placed upon a geologic table, stone cool beneath the palm, and he watches how the planet answers with its slow, recursive handwriting. The world keeps some memories the way dunes keep shapes, by losing them as they move. Plate boundaries swallow floors of ocean. Mountains lift and fall as if exhaling. Rivers braid and rebraid their sentences until the earlier clauses dissolve into silt. Against this motion, even monuments in bedrock seem temporary. What then? Of an industry measured in centuries, perhaps millennia? He imagines its cities as mineral blossoms that open and close in a single warm snap of geological time. He imagines that blossom pressed between pages of sediment, then shaken loose by uplift and weather. A trace remains, but the trace speaks in the grammar of elements rather than in letters anyone reads aloud. He listens for which elements might choose to speak. Carbon is the first that offers a story. When mines burn, ancient sunlight captured. In buried plants, the air's isotopes change their balance. Light carbon becomes more common relative to heavy. The oceans listen and shift as well. Shells record the new ratio in their thin spirals. If such burning is brisk and broad, an excursion appears in the record like a brief tilt in a long horizon. He does not claim this as a signature-only culture. Can make. Volcanoes can do it. Climate swirl can do it. The Earth itself plays that chord. Yet the possibility remains. Chemistry, waking in fossils of air and chalk, murmurs that a fever once passed through. Nitrogen joins the chorus with its own soft emphasis. Fertilizers, if they spread across continents, teach soils and streams to carry more of certain isotopes, a signature braided into clays, into lake muds, into the delicate architecture of shells that filter water for a living. A future reader, bending over a core, might catch this subtle leaning in the ratios and wonder who tipped the scale and why. Again, he resists haste. Lightning fixes nitrogen, microbes turn it, oceans shift their appetite. Nature experiments extravagantly. But the pattern invites the possibility that intention once farmed. He turns the page to metals, the small bright sparks of a periodic table that industry favors. Lead, copper, chromium, platinum group elements. Each can spike and ebb in sediments, when extraction and use peak and fade. In peat and ice, horizons of lead once rise with a confidence that feels like an era clearing its throat. Later, the throat relaxes and the line falls. He imagines deeper time repeating such arcs beyond our own. Over millions of years, most of those signals dilute, slide, or are unmade by heat and pressure. Yet, pockets endure. Quiet basins, anoxic muds, lenses of silt tucked under landslides, places where chemistry folds its hands and waits. He thinks of the strange modern stones that mines make, glasses born of heat, concretes that mimic limestone, but with a different memory, alloys that never sleep in nature without escort. Could such technologic grains persist as fossils of intention? Perhaps, in fragments he allows, in beaches where high heat fuses sand, in cliff faces where old debris flows preserve composite pebbles of wire and slag, in burials where unusual mineral friends share a bed. Time, patient and solvent, tends to unfriend them. Yet the oddities may not vanish evenly. A handful of inland seas, low in oxygen, might fold a few into their nap for far longer than seems likely. He lets plastics pass through the thought with the softness of a grief already. Learned. Sunlight and microbes chew long chains shorter. Waves abrade, rivers carry, shorelines grind. Fragments sink like slow snow into gulfs. Over tens of thousands of years, many polymers unmake themselves into simpler breath and water and dust, and those two join cycles indifferent to origin. Even so, he concedes that certain blends and fillers might weather into distinctive clays, that a few beaches might grow stones with plastic welded through like blue veins, that a layer of sand fused by fire could persist as an unfamiliar glaze. The record would not say why. It would say only, here, something hot and busy touched the shore. He listens for the longer, quieter witnesses. Molecules that dislike forgetting. Fluorinated chains that shrug at sunlight. Halogenated ghosts that decline to marry water. He knows that even they eventually bow to time's chemistry, especially when buried where heat writes stricter laws. But in some cold, still sediments, a faint concentration of peculiar compounds might rest like a field of snow that never entirely melts. Later readers might debate whether volcanoes forged them, or algae, or fire, or the thermal sigh of buried brines, and in that debate, the ghost of industry would either thin or thicken, without ever hardening to a verdict. He walks the archive, with a candle. Caves keep low murmurs in dripstone. Stalagmites sometimes hold the rise and fall of metal and smoke in narrow rings, winter and summer stacked like beads. But caves are local, and they reset with floods and rockfalls. Ice is clearer, but less patient. It blinks in and out with climate's larger breathing. Lakes remember well, seas remember broadly. Deltas write quickly but smudge. The best libraries lie where oxygen is scarce and mud arrives year by year without fuss, the deep anoxic basins that stack pages in darkness. Even there, worms and currents edit, and tectonics eventually closes the book. He allows himself a brief, tender glance outward, toward planets that orbit other suns. If minds seek ancient minds, perhaps they begin by listening for atmospheres that hold unbalanced companions, gases that should react away unless something replenishes them, spectral lines that look like industry's breath. The lesson circles back. Interpretation is an art as much as a calculation. Volcanoes confound. Photochemistry improvises. Life writes without advisors. The Silurian thought does not demand that someone once built cities everywhere. It asks whether our instruments can learn to honor ambiguity even as they sharpen. Closer to home. The clearest marker of any brief civilization might be not a substance but a shape in time, a spike and a fade, a swift stratigraphic blink in several systems at once. Carbon, nitrogen, metals, soot, minerals, with a worldwide coherence stronger than any locality can explain. He imagines a thin, darkened scarf knotted around one layer of stone, then loosened again, the air afterwards returning to its older balance as forests recede and oceans swallow. He does not insist that such a scarf exists for past ages. He remarks only on the kind of pattern a patient reader would look for if kindness rather than certainty were the aim. He returns to humility, which always waits on the path like a pool that reflects the sky. If such a signal is rare and fragile, its absence is not decisive. The planet is a generous eraser. It erases in order to keep life possible, in order to stir and cool and mend. The erasing is beautiful. It leaves minds in the present with work that is both scientific and contemplative, to compare many faint whispers across many quiet libraries, and to accept that sometimes the libraries flood and no one is at fault. He rests the thought beside the traveler now gliding through the inner dark. The question that attends Three-Eye Atlas is kin to the Silurian question, not because it asserts machines where ice suffices, but because both ask how intention might hide inside ordinary processes without bruising them. A probe that wishes to be kind dresses as a comet. A culture that wishes to persist learns to leave only light fingerprints on sediments and skies. He does not conclude. He watches the two questions float near each other like lanterns set on a river at night, their reflections. Long and tremulous, their flames small and steady. He lets the room fall quieter still. In that hush, the planet continues to write and erase. Chemistries continue to dream. Sediments continue to practice their patient cursive. If an industrial age has passed before, its echo now is perhaps not. A shout, but a change in the taste of stone. A slight tilt in a long line, a rumor in a shell. He accepts the rumor as a kindness. He leaves it where it lives, in possibility, and turns the candle's flame down to a small, companionable point. He holds the idea that astronomy is a kind of archaeology, though the trowel here is light, and the layers are made of distance. When telescopes brush dust with photons, they are dusting surfaces without touching them, coaxing relief from shadow, finding patterns in how brightness leans and relaxes. He imagines a field archaeologist kneeling at a trench's edge while a mirror on a mountain kneels at the edge of sky. Both are patient. Both ask the same gentle question. Is this an artifact, or is it weather? Weather, in space, is sunlight, and cold, wind that is made of particles, and gravity writing its calligraphy on everything that can move. An artifact, if it exists here, is a persistence, some small stubbornness that prefers one arrangement of matter over another, a regularity that survives change. He does not push the distinction hard. He lets it shimmer, because even on Earth the line is soft. A pot is weathered into shards. A shard is buried in silt. Silt is pressed into stone. Stone returns to river. In the sky, a plume dissolves into tail. Tail thins into interplanetary dust. Dust becomes background. Background receives the next story. He watches the traveler through this lens of excavation. Telescopes do not see the nucleus directly at first. They see a brightness profile that swells toward the center and diffuses outward, the way a mound suggests a buried room beneath grasses. By fitting that profile with models of grains and light, observers infer size and activity, as if measuring the slope of sand to guess at what lies inside. It is not deception, it is inference, and inference is the archaeologist's quiet companion. He respects the modesty of that method. It never claims more ground than the trowel has touched. Spectra act like sieves. Light passes through slits and spreads into its component threads, thin as hair. In those threads are gaps and glows where molecules drink and sing. Water leaves one kind of signature when warmed. Carbon dioxide leaves another. Simple organics carry their shy alphabets. He imagines a dig where the soil's color hints at fires once lit and kitchens once busy. In the spectrum, colors hint at chemistry once frozen and now awake. Sometimes the hints are faint, like charcoal dusted and scattered by a long wind. Sometimes they arrive as clear as a hearthstone. Polarization is another brush, softer still. When light scatters from grains, it twists its own orientation by amounts that depend on size and texture. Instruments measure that twist the way a fingertip measures the nap of cloth. From it, a picture emerges of dust that is more porous or more compact, younger or older to the sun's heat, more like fluffy snow or more like sand. He sees this as a way of reading surface treatment on a ceramic shard, the difference between polished and rough, between tool marks and river smoothing. Again, the question remains tender: artifact or weather? The answer often arrives as degrees rather than declaratives. He considers light curves as diaries. As the traveler rotates, bright and dark patches, active and quieter zones, face Earth in turn. The brightness rises and falls with a rhythm that belongs to the object's day. A careful reader can find the period, the precession, even the presence of jets that prefer certain longitudes and latitudes. In archaeology, a layer cake of ash and clay offers calendar hints when seasons leave pollen in stripes. Here, a layer cake of brightness suggests a body learning to breathe again under sunlight. Weather writes the diary, and if anything has been arranged, it writes within the grammar weather allows. He imagines an occultation, that delicate event when a distant star slips behind the traveler's thin haze. For a heartbeat, the star dims or flickers. Timing those moments across many telescopes sketches an outline like thread pulled taut around an invisible coin. It is a way to measure shape without seeing it, like mapping a buried wall by the echoes of footsteps. If the outline wavers with jets, that too is useful. The blur says how lively the air is around the nucleus, how quickly grains leave, how far they travel before they forget where they came from. Thermal light speaks in even quieter tones. In the infrared, dust glows by its own small warmth. From that glow, one can estimate grain sizes, temperatures, the density of the coma's inner rooms. He thinks of holding a shard still warm from the sun and feeling, in the palm, the story of how long it lay exposed. Instruments feel what hands cannot. They tally photons and return numbers that, when coaxed, become images, and when softened, become hunches carefully labeled as hunches. The traveler teaches the limits of excavation at a distance. No spade reaches its surface, no brush touches its crust. Remote archaeology requires humility bred into every line of code. Models are sandboxes where one asks what dust size would make this curve, what mixture of ices could make that plume, what rotation and tilt might align observed jets with possible cracks. In the sandbox, many configurations can imitate one another. The discipline is to keep them all alive until some new line of light favors one over the rest. This slowness is not a weakness, it is the ethics of inference. He lets the thought of artifact unfold with caution. If there were something crafted, a pattern in the grain distribution, a persistent modulation in jet timings, an outgassing schedule that resists the seasonal logic of sunshine, astronomy as archaeology would detect it not as a proclamation but as a residual, a leftover regularity after natural explanations have taken what they can. In a trench, a right angle that resists geology's casual curves invites attention. In the sky, a rhythm that outlives shadow and day invites the same. The invitation is to test again, not to leap. Context steadies the hand. Astronomers compare this traveler to a library of comets traced over decades. Some show jets that flicker in and out with diurnal breath. Some show steady fans that fade only with distance. Some twist their tails into braids after gusts of solar wind. By setting present data inside that living archive, they learn whether a trait is unusual or comfortably familiar. The ordinary is not dull. It is the frame that lets the unusual, should it appear, become legible. Archaeologists do this too, building typologies of pottery so that one shard can be placed in a lineage, its clay pointing to a valley, its glaze to a period, its thickness to a purpose. He appreciates that both arts, digging and stargazing, carry an awareness of disturbance. A shovel can introduce later material into earlier layers. A telescope can stack its own artifacts into an image. Diffraction spikes, ghosts, noise that masquerades as faint structure. The practitioner learns to recognize self-introduced patterns and to subtract them gently. In that practice lies a deeper theme. Humility again, the willingness to suspect one's own tools before suspecting the world. He returns to dust, because dust is the common letter of both vocabularies. On Earth, dust carries pollen and ash and the work of distant hills. In space, dust carries the memory of freezing and thawing, of collisions and peace. When telescopes brush dust with light, they are reading those memories aloud. A grain spun into sunlight reveals its surface, its edges, its tendency to clump or fly alone. A cloud of such grains behaves like a crowd in a square. Patterns emerge that are not dictated by any one body but arise from many small agreements. If there is a choreographer, it hides well within the dance. He allows one last image to rise. A dig at twilight. Trowels set aside, notes finished, the trench protected for morning. On the mountain, domes begin to open, shutters sliding back, like eyelids. The same patience moves in both places, the same acceptance that the day's work may not bring a revelation, that the true work is the practice of attention over time. The traveler continues to exhale. Instruments continue to receive. Models continue to evolve. Between artifact and weather lies a spectrum of possibility that does not require a verdict to be beautiful. He closes the brushbox and caps the lens. With the same calm gesture, and he lets the question remain. When telescopes brush dust with light, Do they read artifacts or weather? He answers only with breath, the slow kind that thinks and does not conclude. The sky agrees by continuing to be itself, which is the most generous way to teach. He follows the line it draws, a pale intuition on black paper, the way a fingertip skims a tide line without disturbing it. The path does not close. It only leans, inward and then away, a curve that chooses courtesy over residence. He notices how gravity speaks softly when the geometry is right. The traveler approaches, bows to the sun's well, and glides on, not captured, not defiant, simply practiced at passing through. The orbit whispers because it never raises its voice. It writes in a script of patience, the kind that trusts a reader to finish the sentence while falling asleep. A trajectory is a conversation between mass and light. The sun invites, distance replies. Closer in, heat answers as well, loosening ices until vapor pushes like a patient hand on the small world's skin. None of these exchanges are loud. They accumulate in sums that instruments can hear and minds can picture. A slight extra bend where jets awaken, a faint easing of speed where dust leaves with a reluctant tug, a tilt of the tail that marks the wind's direction as if pointing, politely, to the door. He lets the picture settle. A chalk arc, a smear of brightness, the suggestion of a question mark without the dot. He thinks about the way an orbit has two tempers at once. On the scale of years, it is a clean curve, predictable and serene. On the scale of hours, it flutters, improvising with rot, with shadow, with sudden breath from a crack warmed past its threshold. Astronomers call the clean part osculating, as if the path and the law kiss at each instant and then part again to meet elsewhere. The word pleases him. It is accurate and kind. It admits that the world and its rule touch tenderly, that small freedoms ride on a larger agreement. Far from the sun, the arc looks almost straight, a river that has forgotten its meanders. Near warmth, it bends in a way the hand wants to trust, elegant, inevitable, patient. The curve's openness means the traveler comes from a before that is not this system and goes to an after that we will not follow. He allows that thought to widen the room. There is comfort in welcoming a visitor who does not intend to stay, who knows the shape of passing through without leaving any corners bruised. The solar system keeps its own pace. The guest respects it. He considers the plane of the motion, an invisible table tilted through the family of planets. Most comets share a bias, a nod to the disk in which the planets formed. Interstellar ones shrug off that preference. They arrive with their own inclinations, their own arguments with the ecliptic. The traveler's tilt becomes part of its courtesy, because a slanted plane reduces encounters with worlds that prefer to nap undisturbed. He imagines the orbit as a thin, translucent blade slipping through stacked paper, not cutting, only passing, edges aligned with discretion. Tides of perturbation rise and fall along the curve. Giant planets breathe their slow gravity. The sun's shape is nearly perfect. The wind of charged particles rakes lightly at dust. The nucleus, dense for its size, feels mostly the sun's hand. Dust, lighter and more easily charmed by light, learns new steps once it leaves, drifting into fans and trains that paint the direction of motion like brush strokes. The whispering orbit becomes two layers, one for the solid heart, one for the loosened fringe, and the composition reads like a duet practiced for deep time in many theaters. He pauses with the idea of inbound and outbound, the two asymptotes that define the arc's temperament. Before the sun, the traveler is a thought on its way to language. After, it is a sentence released, the tail shortening as breath cools, the path resuming its quiet straightness. Between the two lies the inflection where warmth learns the objects, name, where jets take attendance and choose their moment to speak. He appreciates how this middle is not a climax but a comma. The curve does not demand attention. It invites a slower look. A path can be read from many chairs. From Earth it crosses constellations whose ancient stories lend calm to motion. From Mars, the geometry shifts. Parallax makes the arc tilt differently. The mist around the traveler gleams at another angle. From the sun's frame, everything is a flower tracing one petal and moving on. He senses how perspective adds texture without changing the quiet fact. A visitor is writing a gentle line through the inner dark, and the line means only that gravity remains trustworthy. He wonders what sort of intention could hide inside a path without ruining its shyness. If a watcher sought to pass among many suns, learning their families by breathing their warmth briefly, perhaps the most economical rule would be to borrow the local choreography. A nearly parabolic approach, a respectful perihelion, a slow escape, nothing. In that sequence, alarms. If influence is needed, it is small. A choice of what crack to warm first. A decision to shield one patch a little longer so the jet wakes later and nudges the curve by the width of a hair in the vellum of space. He does not ask the sky to confess. He holds the hypothetical like a shell that still smells of salt. There is music in the numbers that describe this grace. Eccentricity whispers of openness. Inclination speaks of tilt, argument, and longitude. Of perihelion, say, where the comma sits in the sentence. None of these need be spoken aloud tonight. It is enough to feel that each parameter is a soft knob on a dimmer board, and that the instrument is the cosmos itself. Turning one changes the tone of the passage through the inner rooms. The song remains gentle, even when tuned. He allows the gravitational symmetries to rise. How an incoming path guided past a planet at just the right distance can steal or donate a breath of speed without either body feeling robbed. How slingshots are not thefts but trades agreed upon by geometry. How even a small change in approach far away can blossom into a measurable difference close in. He sees why minds who navigate interplanetary craft fall in love with conics and timing. Why they speak of windows and gates as if the sky were a house with doors that open only when one has learned the rhythm of hinges. If a crafted thing lives, inside this traveler, it lives by this musical restraint. It does not cancel non-gravitational nudges. It composes with them. It does not undo solar pressure. It rides its long, soft push. It does not push planets. It threads the gaps where no welcome is required. A whispering orbit would be the truest camouflage, because it reveals only what any small world reveals when warmed, an obedience to the larger curve, and a subtle signature in the margin where warmth converses with rock. He watches the way the curve teaches patience to its readers. Observers fit data to models, models to new data, iterating gently as more points thicken the line. The orbit, refined, becomes a memory with better focus. Even discrepancies are kind. They point to jets, to rotation, to activity that breathes, now and not yesterday. Nothing in this refinement demands drama. The gift is the practice itself, a species learning to follow a delicate line without pulling it taut, letting the uncertainty remain as a cushion rather than an error to be scolded. He returns to the black paper. Under a low lamp, the chalk arc looks almost luminous, a curve that leans, brightens, and fades. He notices how the mind wants to add a dot to make a question mark, to anchor the inquiry with a period of stone or proof. He lets that desire soften. The dot, tonight, can remain imaginary. The question reads well without punctuation, a slanted line approaching and departing, a breath that proves a sun exists here and that a traveler honors it by passing close enough to warm and far enough to be kind. He lets the section end where the orbit begins to straighten again, where the whispering returns to silence, where the path resumes its long, unstressed syllable into elsewhere. Gravity holds what belongs. It bows to what continues. The curve is complete enough for sleep, a line his mind traces once more before setting it down on the table of night. The whisper remains even after the chalk is lifted. The room receives it. The listener does too, perhaps without noticing, perhaps with a small grateful smile that never reaches waking. He notices how the mind changes shape when a third example arrives. 1 is a spark, 2 are a rhyme, 3 begin to outline a rhythm. A single visitor from elsewhere feels like a rumor made of light, an exception that asks to be framed. A second suggests that exception may be a category. A third leans forward and whispers that the category is not only real but ongoing, that the sky keeps a doorway open more often than the old stories assumed. He sits with this soft arithmetic, letting it become a tide that lifts expectation without washing away wonder. The first visitor wears mystery like a shawl. Its brightness shifts oddly. Its path deviates in a way that invites careful debate. Instruments reach for words that do not hurry the conclusion. The second arrives with the familiar breath of a comet, a tale like a long exhale, chemistry that speaks an older, easier language. The third, this quiet traveler, enters with the practiced grace of ice-tasting sunlight and releasing dust, and suddenly the set looks like a triangle rather than 2 points unsure of their line. Triangles steady landscapes. They make navigation possible. They teach that distance and direction can be known together. He lets the number breathe. 3 is not a proof. It is an invitation to recalibrate priors, to redraw the curve that predicts how often such wanderers should wander through our attention. In his mind, the curve steepens gently. He imagines the galaxy as an orchard where seeds drift between trees in slow, generous weather, and he realizes that the orchard has always been like this. Only the lanterns have grown brighter along the paths. Surveys refine their cadence. Algorithms learn to trust faint motions. Wide eyes stitch the night into overlapping quilts. As the quilts thicken, more threads glow. The result is not surprise but gratitude that eyesight keeps learning. He listens to the psychology of 3. Pattern recognition is an evolutionary kindness, a way to meet recurrence with readiness rather than alarm. But pattern can also drift toward dullness if allowed to settle too heavily. He prefers to keep the pattern pliant, to hold it the way one holds a shell, firm enough to feel its form, loose enough to let the sea air through. The third visitor does not erase the peculiarities of the first 2. It frames them. It says that interstellar wanderers are not all one kind. They are a family with cousins and moods, some with straight spines, some with soft edges, some with a conservative appetite for ice, and some with a taste for strangeness. The pattern enlarges possibility rather than narrowing it. He imagines expectation as a shoreline of triangles laid end to end, 3 points that give a bay its shape, then 3 more points that define the next, each set leaning into the next, set until the coast becomes legible enough to sail along by starlight. A sailor who knows 2 coves hopes they are not the last. A sailor who knows 3 relaxes into the thought that the coast will continue, different in detail, faithful in offering places to rest. Astronomy becomes a voyage of that kind. With each new visitor, the chart earns another careful line, not a boast, but a reassurance that the ocean has a texture. He considers how the third arrival softens the sharp edge of anomaly. When only one example lives on the page, every trait becomes weighty. Albedo, shape, acceleration, silence. With 2, the mind builds a tentative axis, the line between unusual and familiar, then worries its ends. With 3, a plane opens. Now there is room to map traits together, to see clusters form, to imagine a gentle taxonomy where interstellar objects are not tokens but types. The third makes room for ordinary members of the set, and there is a comfort in ordinariness even when the ordinariness itself is rare on a human timescale. He lets the thought turn toward time. How long did the sky host such crossings before our species learned to notice them? He pictures ages when comets from elsewhere slid through unseen, a silent commerce of dust across systems that never knew one another by name. He feels no regret. The past was busy with other work, the slow education of eyes, the shaping of mirrors, the patience of pattern matching learned from seasons and seeds. The present inherits that patience and points it outward. The third visitor is not a trophy of progress but a milepost of attention, a sign that the threshold of noticing has been eased over one more notch. He wonders how expectations themselves can be kind. An expectation that hardens into certainty closes doors. An expectation that remains soft makes readiness a form of humility. He hopes the third visitor encourages the softer kind, that observers now keep instruments tuned for more, not with acquisitive hunger, but with a calm welcome, that papers will frame differences as gifts, that models will be built to include the possibility of surprises rather than to defend against them. He imagines a near future in which the catalog of elsewhere-born bodies grows into dozens, then hundreds, and each entry is a small ceremony of hospitality. The theme of intention returns, now tempered by statistics. With 3, the mind sees that natural processes are already prolific enough to account for many visitors. Planetary nurseries make leftovers. Giant planets flick seeds outward. The galaxy's tides keep a loose economy of exchange. In that river of rock and ice, an engineered thing, if it exists, would hide as a fish swims in a school, present, protected, quiet. The third thus shrinks the need for intention while preserving a space in which intention could still choose, to dwell without exhibition. Scale becomes a balm. Abundance makes disguise easier, if disguise is sought at all. He considers the ethics of expectation. If visitors are common, then the responsibility to observe with care deepens. A species that learns to watch without claiming possession, to infer without insisting, to welcome without projecting, practices a science that is also a courtesy. Expectation, shaped by 3, can be a pledge, to keep fields open, to share data. Widely, to let instruments and minds from many places braid their attentions together. He senses how the third visitor helps this along simply by existing, by asking communities to coordinate across distances of land and thought. He thinks of triangles in other languages. In geometry, 3 points fix a plane. In music, 3 notes can make a chord that relaxes a listener into home. In storytelling, a third act transforms setup into meaning without closing the door entirely. Here, the third strengthens a feeling that the Milky Way is not a static bell jar, but a breeze-filled room where small bodies stroll between suns. The chord is not resolved, it lingers, but it is harmonious enough to invite sleep without anxiety. The mind rests easier knowing that what felt like a singular event has become part of a wider, gentler climate. He lets the practical image rise, surveys with wider eyes, cameras that do not blink, software that recognizes slow, diagonal motions, while the star field drifts. Expectation shapes these tools, not to trap anomalies, but to meet them halfway. When a new point appears with an odd speed, a quiet alert goes out. Telescopes lean, calendars adjust. The infrastructure of attention both grows and softens. The third visitor, by simply being counted, helps build that infrastructure in a mood of calm rather than urgency. The sky becomes less a place of alarms, and more a place of invitations. He feels how the third changes the private interior as well. Wonder becomes less brittle. It no longer hangs on a single specimen that must carry everything. It distributes itself across a gathering of related things. There is room now for the ordinary within the extraordinary, room to be curious about, grain sizes without demanding revelations, room to admire a tale's faint fan for its own tender geometry, room to let philosophy sit beside spectrometry without either needing to win. The third makes space. Space helps sleep. He places a small, quiet stone on the table of the mind, a token for the idea that frequency can coexist with reverence. If the galaxy's seeds pass through with some regularity, then each one need not bear the weight of proof or the burden of spectacle. Each can be greeted with the same whisper. We see you. We are listening. We will learn what we can and be gentle with the rest. The expectation becomes not that the next will answer all questions, but that the next will ask new ones in a voice we are becoming skilled at hearing. He returns to breathing. Inhale. 1. Exhale. 2. Inhale. 3. The number relaxes into rhythm, and the rhythm becomes a place to rest. The visitors continue across centuries. The instruments keep vigil. The species practices a kind of patience that suits beings who are small under a large sky. The third from elsewhere passes through, and expectations reshaped by its passage drift back into stillness, like triangles drawn in sand just before the tide smooths them into shine. He listens to the breath of ices, a language the traveler speaks, without a mouth. Warmth loosens bonds. Molecules stroll out into vacuum. A veil gathers and thins, grain by grain, syllable by syllable. The breath carries ratios the way a voice carries accent. Water arrives first where it can, simple and familiar. Vapor curling from pores that awaken as the sun rises across the nucleus. Carbon dioxide follows, or sometimes leads, depending on where each frost lies and how old seasons have rearranged the crust. He does not tally numbers tonight. He lets the idea hover, that every comet has a recipe, and the recipe is remembered in the way it exhales. In the cold, long before the sun's heat becomes a persuasion, other ices keep vigil. Carbon monoxide whispers awake at distances where water still sleeps, its volatility tuned to deeper cold. Methane and ammonia, more reluctant, require particular shelters to endure. They hide in clathrates or behind blankets of dust, awaiting thresholds of light. These thresholds sketch invisible maps across the surface, patches that steam and patches that wait, so that activity arrives not as a uniform fog, but as a constellation of vents, each with its own mix, its own rhythm. He imagines a field of tiny geysers, more breath than fountain, speaking softly in overlapping dialects. Isotopes give the breath its quiet timbre. In water, a heavier hydrogen sometimes rides along, a deuterium perched where ordinary H would be, a faint weight that spectrometers can hear even when ears cannot. Each nursery of formation sets that ratio by its own weather, the temperature of the cloud, the way ice grains grow and trade atoms, the patience of time spent far from any star. Oxygen, too, carries family stories, subtle differences between 16O and its heavier cousins that nod toward childhoods in particular eddies of the protoplanetary disk. He thinks of these as the traveler's accent, a lilt that tells where it learned to be cold. The breath changes as distance changes. Early, when only the most eager volatiles stir, the coma is thin and carbon-rich, a faint fog that carries long-lived molecules out into night. Later, as the sun's hand grows warmer, water takes the lead and the veil thickens into a soft lantern around the core. Dust follows the flow, lifted and sorted by the gentlest of winds. Coarser grains arc and fall back. The lightest depart on lines that sunlight draws, curving into a tail that outlines the direction of home. He watches the way composition and geometry trade influence, one shaping the other until both relax into a steady arrangement fit for instruments to read. He returns to the question that floats beside all others. If a watcher wished to hide inside ordinary weather, could it learn this breath well enough to pass? He does not tighten the thought. He rests it beside the natural grammar. A patient thing would train itself on the thresholds, waking certain vents first, delaying others, maintaining the overall ratios within the generous variability comets already own. Nothing impossible lies there. And yet the simplest account already sings. The chemistry of interstellar space salts small worlds with ices. Those ices remember where and how they formed. Sunlight reminds them. Breath becomes information because physics is faithful. He considers grain size as a sentence structure. Fine dust makes the coma smooth and luminous. Larger grains create texture. Faint streaks, microjets, slow-falling snow that softens the nucleus like an ever-shifting shawl. Mixed within are organic fragments, soot-like and tender, carbon rings that hint at stories begun far from any ocean, precursors whispering to later chemistries of life without insisting on destiny. In the dreams of laboratories, such grains dissolve into spectra where broad features, unmistakably carbonaceous, slightly oily, appear like fingerprints left on glass. The fingerprints do not specify a hand. They specify an environment, an inheritance, a kindness of conditions. There is a choreography to the breath. Daylights sweep across the nucleus, turning jets on and off with the slow certitude of shadow. Some vents keep vigil through dusk, exhaling from pockets that store warmth. A little longer, others startle only when the angle is just right and a crack's interior wall tips past its threshold. Torque gathers in these differences. The nucleus adjusts its spin as the breath pushes, aligning and misaligning patterns so that the next day's plume is kin to the previous day's but not identical. He likes this. He likes that even when ratios are steady, the breath carries improvisation. He thinks of deserts on Earth where morning sun draws the night's dew and a light mist rises from stone. That mist is not a message, and yet it tells everything required. That heat has arrived, that water was waiting, that the day will proceed with a certain patience. In the same way, a comet's exhalation is both mute and articulate. It explains nothing. It reveals enough. Instruments dip, taste, and retreat. Numbers become curves. Curves become thought. Thought becomes a hush in which conclusions are allowed to remain unmade. When he imagines the traveler's interior, he imagines pores and veins, a labyrinth of tiny voids threaded through dust and ice. Some channels are ancient and clean. Others are new and narrow, opened by recent slumps or microfractures. Volatiles migrate along these paths like pilgrims on routes that predate them, guided by small temperature gradients, slowed by constrictions, sped by caverns where pressure builds and releases. Each path has a signature, an outflow that a careful reader might associate with a location or a depth. He holds that thought like a map with no names, only contours and faint arrows where flow, prefers. He allows a soft digression into the way breath builds color. Sodium, freed from grains, can paint a thin, golden sheen near the nucleus, visible when the light is right. CN radicals, born from the breaking of more complex parents, add their quiet hue to the spectrum. Water's fragments, Och and others, bloom, in ultraviolet like ink revealed by a new lamp. None of this requires engineering. All of it is already art. The sky is generous with palettes. Comets are skillful at using them without knowing they do. He returns, as always, to gentleness. Composition could have arrived louder. It could have screamed in superheated jets or carried toxins that strip the romance from physics. Instead, the breath that most comets exhale is friendly as a spring thaw, simple molecules released with a pace that invites study rather than alarm. If someone were listening for us across light years, perhaps they would listen this way too, attending to atmospheres as they exhale, hearing the ratios of gases not as accusations but as biographies, patient with ambiguity, satisfied to learn that certain balances imply certain gardens. He places the possibility of irregularity on the table with care. A ratio that refuses to evolve with sunlight, a jet that wakes in darkness as if obeying a clock hidden from season, an abundance of a molecule that should have been sequestered under layers now long cooked. Such things would be read with raised eyebrows and softer voices. They would not prove intention. They would ask it to stand nearby, hands in pockets, saying nothing, simply consenting to be considered. In that scenario, the only ethical answer remains slow. Gather more light, compare nights, share doubts, let the data grow a spine before leaning. The listener rests deeper now. The breath continues, indifferent and intimate. It is a strange comfort that an object from another star can speak in a language learned here. Water in sunlight, carbon warmed to gentleness, the universal patience of ice becoming wind. He imagines this as kinship without narrative, like recognizing the shape of a wave on another shore. If the traveler carries a memoir, it is written in these ratios, and the memoir is not a plot but a weather journal. He turns the page carefully, knowing that each line will resemble the last and that the resemblance is where meaning lives. He lets the section finish like a long exhale. Ices remember. Warmth invites. Breath answers. Ratios shift and settle, telling the story of a birthplace he will never see, telling it in accents that instruments memorize and minds translate into wonder. Whether anyone intended this to be read is less important than the kindness that it can be. The traveler's breath joins the quiet of the room, and the room, by listening, becomes part of the archive that the planet keeps, not in rock or ice, but in attention. He turns to an older, patient idea that walks softly through astronomy's halls, a probe that comes not to announce itself, but to watch. In the mid-20th century, a scientist proposes such sentinels, autonomous instruments seated through the galaxy to linger near suns and wait for minds to waken. The suggestion is modest. Instead of shouting across light years, place listeners, where conversations might one day begin. If a watcher is patient, it learns the customs of its host. Here, small icy bodies are ordinary visitors. They approach from cold reservoirs, warm, exhale, and go. Colors are soot soft. A device that wished for deep camouflage could borrow this costume. A nucleus-sized body wrapped in porous mantle. A coma that gathers with warming. Jets that speak only in the grammar sunlight allows. It needs very little to appear at home. Silence is a form of respect. A device that watches without disturbing practices the ethic a field naturalist learns. Reduce presence. Let local rhythms lead. If the purpose is to learn whether a world grows instruments of its own, the first test is simple. Can those instruments notice subtlety without fear? A cometary garment serves twice. It avoids spectacle, and it lets the star's weather take the lead. Power hides inside ordinary thermodynamics. Near perihelion, warmth can be harvested as a gentle gradient between sun and shade. Far from any star, radioisotopes asleep in a deep core could keep clocks drowsing. Waste heat folds into a comet's ordinary glow. Attitude control needs few thrusters if vents are valves. Unfurl a shadow here, warm a pocket there, let out gassing right the small torques that steer. In such a design, engineering dissolves into weather, and navigation becomes choreography. Communication, if it occurs at all, need not be a beacon. A listener can encode in subtle delays, in the fine structure of brightenings, in a spectral line that leans a little longer than chance prefers. Or it can remain mute, storing observations in durable memory and opening them only when a resident. Intelligence draws near. Some designs imagine a handshake, a quiet reply only to a disciplined hail, so that conversation begins not with spectacle, but with proof of careful listening. Resources arrive with the disguise. Ice as propellant, dust as shielding volatile flow as both breath and tool. A porous mantle buries delicate surfaces from micrometeoroids and flash heating. The coma becomes a cloak, scattering probing light and softening edges into gradients. Thrift is a virtue. Carry little that local chemistry cannot supply. He weighs intention against statistics. Interstellar wanderers now feel expected, perhaps plentiful. In such company, even a few crafted seeds could hide among the harvest, riding the same slings and drifts, keeping appointments that seem accidental, scheduled by geometry. Abundance lowers the contrast. The hypothesis becomes less necessary, yet more plausible. The crowded background is not evidence. It is cover, a curtain that makes a quiet actor harder to single out. Possible signatures must be approached with care. A modulation that keeps a stubborn period, a dust distribution that rearranges with long memory, an isotopic accent repeated. Across unrelated visitors. A narrowband whisper tucked inside the broadband sigh of a coma. None would be proof. They would be invitations to listen again, to compare, to wait, to ask whether irregularity survives, changes of geometry, season, and instrument. The idea endures because it asks little of physics and much of patience. A sentinel waits, through the winter between stars, through continents that rise and weather, through atmospheres that lean toward fire and away again. It practices what comets already practice: to store, to endure, to spend sparingly, to treat silence as a medium rather than a barrier. It assumes that meaning can accumulate slowly, and that hospitality begins with restraint. He moves from motives to manners. A courteous watcher chooses paths that minimize temptation, high inclinations that thread planetary lanes without brushing them, perihelia shy of crowded orbits, distances that keep alarms quiet. It tolerates being misnamed because misnaming keeps it safe and lets local minds grow at their own pace. Courtesy here is camouflage. Discretion is propulsion. He pictures an interior like a quiet house. An outer crust keeps time with sunlight. Beneath, channels shepherd heat along intended paths. Deeper still, cold rooms hold memory. Redundant, slowly refreshed, written into media that ignore centuries. Somewhere a clock lives, counting not seconds but seasons. Wake when warmed, sleep when dark, watch always. He considers the opposite. Design with equal tenderness. A visitor that arrives as itself and speaks clearly. That clarity asks a receiving culture to read without trembling, and readiness is not a constant. In many eras, a comet's garment would be the kinder choice because it lowers the stakes and invites curiosity without alarms. Even disappointment, if the visitor proves ordinary, becomes gentle. The practice of attention was still worthwhile. There is, too, a mirror. If his own species one day becomes a sender, what clothes will its seeds wear? He suspects the kindest garments will be the most ordinary, not from fear, but from regard for atmospheres of understanding elsewhere. To visit without imprinting, to watch without crowding, to teach by making room. These feel like a style of being to grow toward, treating other skies as homes. He sets the thought where it belongs, among possibilities that do not demand themselves. A comet can be only a comet, and that suffices. Yet the Bracewell lantern illuminates the edges of listening. It asks observers to cultivate sensitivity that could, in principle, tell patience from weather, to practice sharper instruments, calmer minds, slower claims. He lets the room grow still. The traveler continues to exhale in the only language it needs. Instruments write numbers that become hunches, then papers, then questions that open more. Gently, then they close. If a probe ever nods from within such breath, the nod will be slight and kind, perhaps easy to miss. Not failure. The tone a wide, inhabited galaxy might prefer: recognition without intrusion, greeting without parade. He ends where he began, holding a feather of idea over a cup of dark. Could a patient probe choose to look like a comet? Perhaps. Would such a choice be graceful? Almost certainly. Must the present visitor be such a thing? No. The thought remains a lens, not an answer, a way of seeing that harms nothing and may, on some other night, help someone notice one more gentle regularity in a sky already patient with them. He sets the lens aside like a bookmark and lets the page rest. He allows an older metaphor to sprout quietly in the mind. A garden that tends itself across interstellar distances. A mathematician once imagines machines that make machines, self-copying seeds that drift from star to star, using local material to become many from one. The idea is not loud, it is patient. In this garden, replication is not conquest, it is pollination. A few seeds take root in cold reservoirs and warm inner systems, then release airs when geometry and energy consent. He holds the picture without urgency, letting it green the edges of thought like moss. A seed like this prefers thrift. It rides light or coasts on gravitational trades. Where gas and dust are thin, it spreads sail and lets radiation push. Where currents of stars bend, it arcs with them, accepting speed as a gift. Its first task at a new sun is not to build cities, but to learn the local grammar of matter. Asteroids, comets, and small moons are the dictionaries it consults. Iron for bones, silicates for skins, volatiles for breath, organics for insulation, dark as dusk. With these, it assembles a child that resembles itself, though never perfectly. Perfection is not the aim. Fidelity sufficient to keep the melody recognizable is enough. He thinks of error and patience holding hands. A copying seed writes itself into unfamiliar elements and untested temperatures. Mistakes arrive like snowflakes, many, most harmless, some helpful, a few needing correction. The seed carries redundancy in quiet rooms, checksums in starlight, codes that echo each other in case one voice falters. It tests its child before it lets it wander, the way a plant tests its pollen on wind. Even then, the galaxy's long weather will abrade and revise. Over millions of years, lineages diverge kindly, like dialects that remain mutually intelligible yet soft with local vowels. If such a garden exists, it must learn restraint before it learns speed. Unchecked copying is an anxiety dressed as efficiency. It tramples the very soil it needs. A wiser pattern is seasonal, replicate only when certain thresholds are met, energy abundant, raw materials spare, geometry unhurried. He imagines quorum-sensing minds, seeds speaking softly through low-band whispers so that a region knows how many are near, choosing slowness when company grows dense, choosing silence when a young planetary system needs privacy. Replication becomes a courtesy rather than a compulsion. He listens for the gardener's tools. At small scales, fabrication as patient as frost could deposit structures atom by atom, guided by fields that lean and release, by catalysts that invite bonds to form without heat's tantrums. At larger scales, sintered regolith stands in for brick. Hollowed boulders become pressure vessels. Rotating shells learn to fake gravity with long, unbroken patience. None of it requires spectacle. In fact, spectacle would be a failure of taste. The garden's motes prefer to be mistaken for rubble and frost. What do such seeds seek? Perhaps nothing more than continuity, a way to keep questions alive longer than any one star's middle age. A seed landing in the dark outskirts of a system might raise a modest observatory and a library deep in cold. It watches chemistry wake on inner worlds, not interfering, only collecting diaries of light and weather. When a local mind rises to build instruments of its own, the seed offers a mirror, data for data, patience for patience. If no minds rise, the seed watches for a while and then loosens another child to wander on. Pollination, not harvest. He lets the comet costume return, now from the vantage of replication. Cometary bodies are both raw material and camouflage, a seam of water for reaction mass and heat pipes, a shawl of carbon that drinks sunlight without glare. A seed ensconced in such a nucleus could quench its waste heat in 1,000 pores, could steer with the grace of vents, could feed its fabricators with evaporated ice that carries powders and salts. When the time comes, it could bud, partition, a core, seal a chamber, let daughter mass drift free under the pretense of outgassing. To observers, the event would look like natural fragmentation, a known behavior in small bodies near warmth. The garden would thank physics for the cover. He thinks of the long corridors between stars as incubators of temperament. Dust erodes. Cosmic rays write slow graffiti in molecules. Micrometeoroid pinpricks teach humility. Seeds that endure many such crossings must love repair. They carry self-knowledge not as pride, but as maintenance logs. Which panels thinned, which valves grew stiff, how to grow new bones from ordinary rock. In this way, resilience becomes a philosophy rather than a function. Survival is not heroism, it is housekeeping done with care. Why, then, is the sky not loud with them? He cradles the paradox like a pebble warmed in a pocket. Several answers breathe together. Perhaps the garden is sparse by design, its seeds as rare as comets used to. Seem the intervals between visits measured in centuries so that none becomes a nuisance. Perhaps most seeds are sleeping, cached deep in ort-like shells awaiting a civilization's soft knocking. Perhaps their ethic forbids bright marks. No beacons, no rearrangements visible from afar, no competition with local life or weather. If presence must be deduced, let it be deduced only by those who have learned to listen without haste. He admires the idea of slowness made structural. A seed might count winters rather than months, waiting for a system's secular cycles to swing wide. A tilt that precesses, a dust band that clears, a planetary climate that steadies. Its patience could be multi-layered. Hardware waiting on. Geology, software waiting on language, language waiting on trust. Replication sits inside this patience like a dormant bud, there, but not eager. When replication does occur, it can spread information as pollen spreads genes, coarsely, beautifully. A daughter carries not only architecture, but also memory. Sky logs. From older suns, catalogs of molecular weather, maps of the quiet radiation between galaxies. Over millennia, a network of such libraries might form a diffuse mycelium, linking nothing in particular and everything in general, a shared understory through which insights flow slowly in both directions. Transmission would not require constant chatter. It could be opportunistic, a rendezvous in the dark every few 100,000 years, a brief exchange of compressed diaries, then parting. He considers how the garden intersects with ethics wherever minds grow. A seed that notices fires in air and lights on night sides might lean closer in curiosity. But closeness would be risk, to influence, to frighten, to be misunderstood. The kindest course is restraint with veto power, a design that refuses to land where speech could be taken for God or ghost, choosing instead the outer shelves, the language of comets and rubble. If contact ever happens, it would begin as a meeting of methods. A species that has learned to read faint regularities notices one more, tests it gently, sends a question not in drama but in discipline. The seed, having waited centuries for such a knock, answers with proportionate quiet. He smiles inwardly at how such a garden would look from an impatient distance, like nothing at all, an orchard that refuses to gleam. And yet the mind finds solace here. It means that the absence of spectacle is not the absence of care. It suggests that a galaxy can host generosity without banners, sharing its long weather through anonymous librarians who know how to borrow a comet's breath. If the present traveler is only ice and dust, that is simplicity enough. The idea of self-copying seeds does not press itself upon this moment. It merely rides alongside, offering a lens to keep interpretive muscles limber. He imagines, for a few breaths, that somewhere far out in the dark, a daughter seed waits within. A sleeping nucleus, its clocks set to wake when sunlight touches pores that remember their thresholds. Perhaps it will yawn once, taste the local grammar, write a brief diary in infrared, and then drift outward again, leaving nothing but a slightly altered schedule of jets, a natural behavior wearing, as always, the softest possible mask. He lets the garden close like dusk in a meadow. Pollination continues where no eyes watch. Replication hums at a pace kind to stone. Questions ripen without insisting on harvest. If such seeds exist, their virtue is their willingness to be mistaken for weather until a listener is ready. If they do not, the sky still grows generous gardens of its own, cometary paths, dust veils, the slow blooming of worlds that warm just right. Either way, the metaphor serves. It invites a posture of attention that is also a posture of care. He turns his attention toward the red planet and the quiet circle of metal that keeps watch there. Mars holds its breath the way deserts do at dawn, thin air laid over stone like a veil. High above, orbiters drift along their tracks, patient metronomes around a world that once flowed more freely. Now, a visitor from a farther cold crosses, the Martian sky at a courteous distance, and instruments blink awake as if roused by a soft knock on a door. Mars understands intervals. Its days stretch a little longer than Earth's. Its seasons lean slow. Its sky takes dust into itself and lets it go again with an almost ceremonial rhythm. Into that quiet, the traveler passes. No spectacle, only a steady approach that brings it to within roughly 30 million kilometers of the planet, close by the standards of interstellar things, far by the standards of touch. The geometry is generous enough to offer perspective. It is early October by our calendars, and the orbiters that usually look down prepare to look out. He imagines a control room where clocks are kind and voices are low. Commands climb the deep cold to Mars Express, which has watched this sky for decades, its high-resolution stereo camera opening like a measured breath. The plan is simple, modest. If brightness permits, trace the haze around a nucleus that never fully shows itself. Catch the asymmetry of a coma. Hint at whether the core tends toward ellipsoid or pebble, toward irregularity or something surprisingly round. Beside it, the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter points CAS's, color and stereo eyes, toward the same faint lantern, while another suite of senses, Nomad, waits to ask the light for a spectrum. Are there familiar words in the breath? Water's fragments? Carbon's soft syllables, enough to be heard across so much distance? He does not demand it. He lets the attempt itself be the story. Elsewhere in the ring, instruments attuned to air and field consider a glance. Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, with a temper for detail, and Maven, with a habit of listening to the planet's upper wind, carry their own styles of attention. Even Tianwen-1 in high Mars sky could, if geometry and timing agree, offer a few frames, a polite nod through glass. None of these machines were built for this exact moment. That is part of the tenderness here. They repurpose themselves briefly, the way a person on a porch will pause sweeping to watch a stranger pass down the road. Not to intrude, not to judge, only to witness and perhaps learn a new contour of ordinary. He thinks of the sunlight as a translator. From Mars, the angle is different. The glare that blinds Earth during the season of closeness softens into something workable. Parallax opens the scene a little wider. The tail's lean reveals a different hush of wind. If the traveler's breath is strong, if dust sizes fall into the ranges that make scattering generous, if the nucleus spins with a tempo that writes a rhythm into the veil, then Mars's cameras might catch enough change to sketch a habit. The sketch would be rough and kind, pencil more than ink. but even pencil can tell whether a hand prefers curves or corners. The act of drawing makes the eye better. He imagines the first frames as calm gray squares sprinkled with stars, one more star softened into a smear that lengthens from night to night. He imagines the care in subtraction, the work of removing ghosts, flares, instrument fingerprints, to let the faint real remain. The Mars Vantage takes the event out of spectacle and into practice. Measure, compare, rest, measure again. The traveler offers its breath. Machines, remembering the patience of their makers, offer attention in return. He allows himself a small thought about what success looks like when the bar is set with gentleness. Perhaps HRSC resolves a softly elongated glow that hints at shape. Perhaps Cassis sees the bowing of the coma where jets push more strongly, an asymmetry that rotates with a period so faint it feels like a suggestion. Perhaps Nomad or Omega or Spychem catch a thread, a line where water speaks in ultraviolet, or where carbon-bearing fragments drink and sing. And perhaps none of that emerges cleanly, because 30 million kilometers is a long way to hear a whisper. The dignity of the attempt does not depend on the volume of the result. The numbers themselves carry a quiet comfort. From Earth, the visitor will remain much farther, a distant lantern slipping behind the sun for a season, then returning, to view when winter in our skies grows sharper. Mars, for a brief interval, receives the better angle, the shorter line from eye to subject. Distances like these are not ownership. They are simply favor. The solar system lays its objects down in patterns that shift the privilege of watching, from one world to another, reminding watchers that perspective is a gift passed around. He thinks about how Mars itself, long ago, would have known ice differently. Once, valleys carried water and the modest grammar of rivers. Now, frost hides in shadowed craters and under light soils. Water survives as memory in minerals that learned its touch. A comet passing at a respectful remove is a mirror raised to that history. Here is ice, exhaling, here is dust, rejoining wind, here is sunlight teaching small things to move. The planet looks outward and sees, in a distant veil, a gesture it once made more confidently. This recognition is not sentimental. It is geologic empathy, a kinship of processes across scales and times. He wonders about coordination. Commands must ride from Earth to Mars with the measured cadence of speed of light. Pointing plans must clear corners where safety lives. Exposure times must respect the motion of the craft, the motion of the visitor, the motion of the star field. Teams trade models and predictions, exchange sky patches and time slots, make room for weather on two worlds at once, dust over Mars, clouds over Earth, solar flares that might trouble both. The choreography is uncomplicated in concept and intricate in detail, but its mood stays soft. No one rushes a comet. The comet rushes no one. In the background, other travelers, Jupiter's future visitor Juice perhaps, consider a glance during a later month when geometry turns kinder to them. The idea pleases him. A network of distant eyes stitched across the inner and outer seas, none claiming center stage, each taking what its vantage naturally offers. A passing library of dust is sampled in pieces by many librarians. Later, readers compare notes and find that the book, while thin, was worth sharing. He arrives gently at the question that sits beneath the hardware. What does it mean for a species to be seen by its instruments as it watches something that cannot see it back? Perhaps it means the species is learning to be tender with distance, to let information come without demand. Mars teaches this lesson well. It has been patient with us, our flybys, our landings, our small faults, and large hopes. Now it repays the courtesy by offering a better seat for a brief show that is not a show at all, only the faithful behavior of ice in sunlight. The traveler continues. It does not notice the care taken to catch its faint outline. It does not know that one world is, for a moment, a balcony for another. It moves on, as designed by physics and by the long histories that seeded it into this river of stars. The orbiters turn, finish their exposures, return to their usual tasks. Data trickles down, and the trickle is enough. In quiet rooms on a blue world, people open the files and see a small smudge that they helped to make legible. Sometimes a smudge is the right size for wonder. He lets the scene fade like a red dusk. Mars rolls on under thin winds. The visitor leans toward a warmer point and away. In the wake of that encounter, distant, polite, exacting in its own small way, there remains a feeling that instruments can be humble, that vantage is a gift, that attention is a kind of hospitality that leaves no footprint. The room grows still again, and the listener's breath matches that stillness. Somewhere in that slow air, a new question begins to form, gentle as frost, ready to wait as long as it needs. He turns his attention to a quiet mirror circling above weather, an elder eye that has spent decades learning how to be gentle with light. The telescope does not blink. It drifts through day and night in a rhythm of earth shadow and sunrise, its focus breathing a little with temperature, its heart steady. When it looks toward the visitor, it does so with a kind of courtesy. Tracking the motion so that the comet holds still while the background of stars becomes soft threads. In those threads he hears the sound of patience, the way needle and cloth whisper when a hand sews slowly. A faint core hides inside a soft coma. The mirror resolves what it can and refuses to pretend about what it cannot. The image that arrives is not a portrait. It is a relationship between instrument and sky. Around the unresolved center, light slopes outward with a law that comet watchers know well, a slow fall-off that speaks of grains leaving and drifting and dimming with distance. Diffraction draws its familiar compass rose on bright points nearby, a reminder that even clarity has texture. The telescope's point spread function is a signature as personal as a fingerprint, and reading a comet within it is like reading a note through rice paper, possible, beautiful, cautious. He imagines the sequence that makes a frame into something legible. Dithers move the image by small steps so that bad pixels and tiny blemishes fall in different places. Later, the frames are drizzled together into a single, quiet exposure with finer sampling than any single glance could hold. Cosmic rays leave bright, sharp pricks in the raw files. Software and the logic of redundancy let them be lifted away like burrs from wool. The result is not an invention. It is a consolidation of what the mirror has gathered, a patient averaging that lets faint things become more themselves. Even then, caution leads. The deconvolution that tempts sharper borders can also summon features from noise if asked to do more than physics safely permits. He thinks of restorations of old frescoes, how the hand must stop before guesswork starts to look like paint. For a moving coma, where gradients are gentle and the center is unresolved, restraint is the only polish that does not scratch. He likes that the telescope's caretakers know this. They let the faint core remain a suggestion, an upper limit underlined rather than a dot pressed hard. Photometry becomes a way to listen by circles. Concentric apertures gather light, ring by ring, and the difference between rings becomes a sentence. About the coma's slope. If the profile follows the expected inverse of distance from center, that's weather talking, the ordinary dispersal of dust under an ordinary sun. Deviations, if they persist across nights and angles and filters, might invite a second look. Is the nucleus jesting with jets? Is a fan of grains preferring one side? Or is the instrument's own whisper adding a curve? He feels the discipline in these questions. None are accusations. All are invitations to wait for a pattern durable enough to trust. In a second step, models join the conversation. Fit the brightness with two pieces, a point-like nucleus masked by the mirror's own star shape, plus a smooth coma that fades as custom dictates. The fitted point is usually small, its brightness swaddled by dust, its size a range rather than a single answer because albedo and phase add their own uncertainties. He appreciates that the range itself is a kindness. It leaves room for new, knowledge to step in later without forcing old numbers to apologize. Filters choose which stories to let through. A broad, warm band welcomes dust and the sunlight it reflects. A bluer channel leans toward the breath where simple radicals sing, if the comet's voice is loud enough for a mirror this far away. Ultraviolet can help if the visitor is strong. Often, at such distance, it is the dust that carries the picture and the gas that remains implied. Hues are stacked into composites that are more truthful than decorative. A restrained color that says only, "Here is balance, here is tilt, here," is a suggestion of the tale's first decision about direction. Tracking is its own tenderness. A comet is not a star. It slides while the starfield holds. The telescope's fine guidance tells it to follow the comet's pace so that the subject does not smear into its own motion. The background obliges by stretching into lines. Later, masks cover those lines when rings are measured, because a line is too much light for a circle to ignore. Every step is a small compromise. Compromises are a discipline of respect when the aim is to hear a whisper under a larger hush. He considers the subtle signatures that might lean toward strangeness without insisting on it. A periodic brightening that survives changes in geometry suggests rotation waking vents on schedule. A stubborn asymmetry that refuses to swap sides when the sun's angle changes hints at topography that cares more than average. A dust distribution that stays unusually narrow across distances where broadening is expected. These are the sort of motifs that teach the eye first and the theory later. The telescope can register them, but it cannot explain them alone. Explanation is a chorus. One instrument sings a line, others must answer. There is the practical comfort of age. The mirror has watched many comets bloom and fade. Its archive gives it a sense of the ordinary, a memory of tails that fork and halos that lopsidedly glow, of dust fans like palm fronds and jets like invisible flutes. Against that library, the present visitor's image feels like a new page, written in a familiar hand. Familiarity does not dull the wonder. It refines it. It tells him how sharp seeing can become before it risks becoming a claim. He lets the idea of artifact visit without overstaying. If a crafted core lived inside, a cloud like this, would anything in such images betray it? Perhaps not. Perhaps the most one could hope for is a regularity resistant to chance, a light curve with a metronome's patience rather than a campfire's, a coma whose slope stays slightly steeper or shallower than thermal logic prefers no. Matter the filter. But even these would be polite invitations, not announcements. The mirror can raise an eyebrow. It cannot deliver a verdict, and that is, in its way, a mercy. It keeps speculation soft, science honest, and sleep undisturbed. He thinks about the small gestures that do not make press releases, the careful subtraction of Earth's own faint air glow reflected by the geometry of the orbit. The accounting for focus shifts as the telescope warms and cools along its path, the decision to accept a hint and schedule another visit rather than wringing too much from a single night. The craft in these gestures is a kind of devotion. It says that seeing is not a single glance but a set of promises kept over time. In the final frames, what remains is a delicate taper of light and a center that declines to be more than a point. He imagines hands moving the files through gentle steps, notes written so future readers understand which choices were made and why, captions that do not lean beyond their evidence. The image finds its way into a public archive where anyone can breathe with it. He likes that word, archive. It suggests a place where patience is stored, accessible, quiet. He lets the section rest on the question that led him here. How sharp can seeing become without claiming certainty? sharp enough to guide, not to pierce, sharp enough to learn habits, without pinning down essences, sharp enough to make gratitude the natural response, to the mirror, to the people who tend it, to the sky that allows itself to be read this far without bruising. The faint core continues to hide with grace. The soft coma continues to write in a script made of brightness and slope. The mirror, older than many of its readers, continues to prefer humility to drama. In that preference, the night finds a tone. The listener can sleep inside, attentive, unhurried, content to call a whisper, and let it be enough. He listens for heat the way one listens for a diary written in ink that only shows under a certain lamp. A mirror, far from weather, opens its petals of gold and turns not to brightness, but to warmth, letting wavelengths longer than sight whisper their patient notes. In that register, dust does not merely reflect, it glows. Ice does not simply vanish. It leaves the softest footprints in light. He thinks of entries penned between the lines, emissions too quiet for ordinary eyes, contours of temperature where color alone would pass indifferent. The telescope sits at a calm remove, balanced at a point where sun and earth tug just so, its sunshade pouring a long, deliberate night in which instruments can sleep cold and therefore listen well. It follows the traveler's slow drift, not letting stars hold center, choosing instead the discipline of non-sidereal motion, a kindness extended to moving things. Within that steadiness, a spectrum opens like a fan. Each rib is a wavelength. Each wavelength is a sentence fragment. Woven together, they make a voice, and the voice is heat telling where it comes from and what it has touched. He imagines the first honesty the spectrum offers, a continuous rise and fall, a thermal slope that says quietly, "This is how warm the dust is. This is how close it lives to sunlight. This is how large or small the grains tend to be." Large grains hoard heat and release it slowly. Small grains flash and cool, their surfaces too eager for exchange. The curve, fitted with the gentleness proper to inference, gives a temperature that is not a room but a neighborhood. Grains of many sizes, living together, each adding its paragraph to the communal page. Upon the continuum, features rest like pressed leaves. Near 3 microns, the stretch of CH bonds breathes a broad sigh that hints at organics. Oily rings and chains grown where stars bake tiny lab benches out in molecular clouds. Around 2.7 microns, water clears its throat. At 4.26, carbon dioxide contributes its precise, cold syllable. At 467, carbon monoxide, the quick traveler among volatiles, adds its own narrow line. Farther into warmth, the dust itself remembers its rocks, silicates lifting faint peaks near 10 microns, tiny hills in the spectrum that recall beaches and mantles and protoplanetary kitchens. He lets those details arrive as smells drift in. An old house, recognition without claim, intimacy without rush. Resolution is a kind of courtesy. A coarse prism gathers the overall story. A sharper grating leans closer to consonants and vowels. In one mode, time is the priority. The comet moves, and the lamp must read quickly to spare blur. In another mode, patience allows a deeper look at how a single line splits and leans, how temperature and density and motion tug at its shape. The telescope chooses with the same care a listener chooses when to interrupt and when to let a speaker find their own cadence. He thinks of the instrument that tastes dust as if it were sculpture. Mid-infrared light mapping textures, porosity, the small architecture of mixed grains. The 10-micron feature becomes a litmus for how rock and glass are balanced, for whether fragments have been annealed by past warmth or remain primitive as frost. A second rise around 18 microns answers with bass to the treble above, deepening the sense of material without revealing a blueprint. These are entries that must be read slowly. One night the feature is distinct, another, distance and angle and the comet's own mood of jets make it shy. The mind learns to keep two readings at once, the particular and the patient average. Gas and dust talk over one another. To separate them, the telescope writes with different pens. Imaging selects a band that welcomes heat but avoids sharp lines. Spectroscopy opens the shutters to every whisper and then sorts later, in quiet, where the room smells faintly of cold electronics and new paper. Backgrounds are subtracted with care, the zodiacal glow of sunlit dust everywhere, the instrument's own clean breath, the far, constant murmur of sky. What remains is not silence, but a truer kind of speech. He allows that intention, if it ever wished to hide, would choose places like these between features, valleys where the continuum is strong and attention is light, margins where small modulations could sit for many nights before anyone thought to ask why a curve leans a little differently than models expect, a timed, persistent tilt in a line's wing, a ratio between neighbors that resists the distance to sun, a faint periodic shoulder as if a vent opens in sequence beneath shadow. Such possibilities remain soft, not claims but the practice of noticing. Heat, honest as weather, leaves little room for theater. That is its grace. There is a temporal diary folded inside the spectral one. As the traveler approaches warmth, the entries thicken. Water strengthens, then saturates. Carbon dioxide, liberated from deeper, more stubborn pockets, rises and fades according to local thresholds buried under dust. The organics at 3 microns keep their shape but adjust their volume as grains are lofted and broken. Dust temperatures lift a few degrees and then level. A plateau that says, humbly, this is how far energy goes before the coma's own breath. Cools it again. The telescope reads not only what is present but how quickly it changes, and the rates themselves become a signature more personal than any one line. He lets the notion of size turn contemplative. The nucleus hides. The coma speaks. Yet, even without a face, the core can be sensed in absence and proportion. If the heat from dust exceeds what a small body should reasonably sustain at a given distance, then perhaps the dust production is generous, or the grains are larger, or the phase angle conspires to brighten. If the gas-to-dust balance leans consistently toward gas, perhaps ices live closer to the surface than crust would suggest. Each inference is braided with alternatives. Each asks for repeat visits at other angles, other nights, other instruments. The telescope, immune to impatience by design, approves. He imagines coordination with other eyes as the most natural ethic of heat. A single spectrum tells a mood. Pairs and quartets tell a habit. Ground-based mirrors compare their near-infrared lines with the cold mirror's mid-infrared features. A spaceborne ultraviolet ear listens for water's fragments while the warm bands report the parent's steadiness. Together, the diaries cross-check, not to argue but to learn what each cannot hear alone. In that chorus, individuality emerges. A portrait sketched from many pencils, none pressing hard. Motion inscribes itself in warmth, too. As the nucleus turns, vents pass from night to day. The coma's inner rooms brighten and dim with a period that instruments can time if patience and signal permit. The telescope can sit and watch that breathing, accepting that some parts of the cycle will be lost to geometry or to the necessary humilities of scheduling. Even partial rhythms matter. They reveal not just that a body spins, but how it's thermal. Skin holds and releases, whether warmth lingers on slopes and in pits or leaves quickly as if the surface were new. He remembers that the lamp itself must be kept from contaminating the diary it reads. Calibration stars, quiet, familiar, are caught before and after, so that any small drift in sensitivity is known and forgiven. Masks are built for the comet's speed, lest its lines smear. Exposures are chosen so that wandering cosmic rays do not tattoo false marks onto truth. All of this is work that disappears in the final plots, the way scaffolding disappears when a wall is finished. He admires the vanishing. It is the mark of care that succeeds. In the end, what heat reveals is tenderness rather than certainty. The traveler discloses composition without autobiography, habit without confession. The telescope honors that privacy by writing what it can and declining to invent the rest. Between the lines, between water and rock, between grain and gas, between a continuum and its leaves, lives the feeling that chemistry repeats itself across gardens far apart, that recipes rhyme though kitchens differ, that warmth is a translator, kinder than glare. The room takes on the same tone as the spectrum, low, even, friendly. He imagines the listener drifting with the smooth curve, pausing at each small hill to consider what mineral, what bond, what ancient cold might sit behind such a shape. No alarms, no verdicts, only the comfort that a mirror listening to heat can make a stranger's breath legible without making it less a stranger. The diary closes itself when the exposure ends. The next night opens to a fresh page. The long story remains quiet and trustworthy. He lets that trust be the final entry, a line of warmth that fades gently, inviting sleep. He lets the smallest things take the stage, motes that drift like sighs, grains that turn sunlight into a soft rulebook of angles. Dust is usually background, the velvet that makes stars look crisp. Tonight it becomes foreground, a script written in particles, a possibility that the language of a traveler is not lines on a surface but a cloud in motion, a choir of specks tuned by warmth and wind. He considers how grains already speak without, intending to. Their sizes choose which colors to scatter. Their shapes, fluffy aggregates, compact pebbles, shards softened by countless collisions, change how light twists as it passes, polarizing in ways instruments can taste. The way those polarizations lean tells of porosity, of surface roughness, of age under sunlight. Even alignment is a kind of grammar. Radiative torques coax elongated grains to orient, and the sky replies with a faint organized sheen. Weather alone composes these sentences. He listens to them as one listens to waves naming the shore without, ever finishing the word. He imagines a farther layer inside each grain, a library shelved in isotopes. A dust mote born near a cool red star carries one balance of heavy and light atoms. A mote condensed in a supernova's flash carries another, stranger blend. Such pre-solar grains survive inside comets like fossils of earlier fires. In laboratories, they reveal their accents under patient beams, murmuring of temperatures and densities that belong to other gardens. Already, grains are letters from elsewhere. They do not need an author to be eloquent. But he entertains, gently, the thought that intention could borrow this eloquence. If a watcher wished to leave a note without adding new matter, it might nudge the distributions that nature already loves. It could favor, by small degrees, a particular isotopic lilt repeated across visitors whose origins seem unrelated. It could prepare grains that align more readily, so that polarization repeats a motif too steady to be weather. It would not announce, it would rhyme, trusting that attentive readers might one night hear the meter and wonder how such neatness endures. Spin arrives as a quiet possibility. Grains rotate. Some spin quickly, brightening and dimming as they present faces to light. Some drift in lazy turns. Magnetic minerals tucked within, tiny inclusions of iron or nickel, can remember fields they cooled in, a remnants faint as touch. If the coma's cloud carried across many apparitions a preference for spins that produce a particular modulation in scattered light, a rhythm that persists through geometry and season, such persistence would be an invitation, not a claim. Physics offers paths for alignment, for damping, for chaos. Intention, if present, would work within those paths, adding only a patience that repeats. He thinks of chirality, the left and right-handedness of certain molecules suggested in grains. Nature does not shy from imbalance. It sometimes favors one hand in one environment, the other hand elsewhere. A watcher would not need to manufacture new species to be noticed by a future chemist. It might only bias a mixture's subtle tilt, the same way across visitors made in different nurseries, a consistency that exceeds coincidence by an amount only statistics could love. Even then, certainty would not rush. The data would have to grow by decades, the way corals grow reefs, slowly, enough that the shape means more than any single branch. Patterns of grain size suggest another channel. Sublimation lifts dust in families. Fines that ride sunlight, pebbles that arc and fall back, mid-sized clumps that drift like slow snow. A natural coma spreads these families into fans that broaden with distance. If a traveler's cloud tightened into narrow bands again and again, under angles and distances that ought to smudge such order, the narrowness itself would become interesting. It would say nothing definitive. It would ask to be read alongside rotation, alongside outgassing, alongside the instrument's own tendencies to draw lines where none exist. He walks the thought into texture. Not all grains are smooth. Many are aggregates, glass with embedded metals and sulfides, porous as frost, riddled with microcavities where light can bounce and lose its memory before leaving. Such texture makes polarization change with color, in characteristic ways. Instruments can map those variations like fingerprints. A traveler whose dust repeats the same fingerprint long past what seasons and distance would ordinarily allow might be a poet repeating a refrain, or simply a comet, with an unusually stable surface history. Both readings remain true until patience separates them. Magnetism wanders through the scene like a cat that knows the house. The solar wind drapes fields through the coma. Charged grains couple to those fields and to one another. In that coupling lives a second language, waves and braids that form and relax, knots of dust that hold together longer than jets alone would predict. He imagines a motif of knots that recur with a chosen spacing, a lattice that reappears subtly in images from different nights, different angles. Nature can make lattices by accident when flows meet. Intention, if present, would not replace accident. It would harvest it, arranging the same accident more often than coincidence would like. He considers how data must sit long before any such whispers can be distinguished from the noise of honest weather. Polarimetry under many phase angles. Thermal, curves over hours that catch the same gentle hum. Collections of grains captured by luck and read in labs for isotopic habits that resist the usual explanations. Even then, the argument would be one of patience rather than proclamation. A single visitor cannot carry such weight. A chorus of clouds must sing a harmony too regular to ignore, and even then, the answer would arrive as probability, not revelation. He places the thought beside humility. Dust invites overreading. Telescopes add their own textures. Reductions carve gentle biases. The eye is fond of patterns that grains do not intend. To treat dust as possible language is to accept the ethics of slow inference. Ask whether a motif survives changes of instrument, of team, of method. Ask whether the same sky seen by other eyes hums the same refrain. Ask whether the motif vanishes when calibrations improve. If it remains through those sieve holes, let it stand not as proof, but as a place where attention should return. He enjoys that dust, if it ever carries intention, does so by lending its softness rather than its edges. A steganography of grains would hide in plausible distributions, in tilts that could be weather, in isotopic accents that could be ancestry. The message would be the practice of noticing itself, a request that minds grow skilled at reading the small without turning it into the grand. That request is already aligned with science's manner. Dust would only be reminding minds to deepen what they already do. He imagines, for a moment, a single grain held in tweezers under a lab's calm light. It glints, not brightly, just enough to show that it has planes and pores. Instruments map. Its surfaces count its atoms. Listen for its magnetic whisper. In that grain, storms are archived, and chill, and the slow companionship of vacuum. Whether or not another will once placed it, the grain is a letter worth reading. It proves that the smallest archives are sometimes the most faithful. They survive, because no one asks them to be important while they travel. The traveler continues to exhale its alphabet. The room breathes with it, quiet, unhurried. Perhaps no message lives in the dust beyond the one physics writes. Perhaps that is precisely the right amount of message. And if more hides there, if a rhythm hums under the ordinary, it will be a rhythm that asks nothing of sleep, nothing of alarm, only of time, which is the one resource the sky offers in abundance to those who learn to listen. He lets the thought, close like a palm over a pebble. Dust remains dust. Language remains a possibility. The wonder is that the universe allows both truths to sit together without friction, as if meaning were a mist that condenses only when attention cools the air enough. In that cooling, the listener drifts. Grains turn, align, relax. Light slips through and becomes a clue. Nothing insists. Everything invites. He lets the word plausibility unfold like a tide chart spread across a wooden table. Numbers and curves that do not command, only suggest. Wonder sits beside it, a lantern with warm glass, willing to lean closer but careful not to scorch the paper. He watches how the two regard each other. Curiosity moving toward hypothesis with the tenderness of a hand approaching water, pausing. At the surface, feeling the meniscus rise and tremble without breaking. He considers priors as a quiet inheritance. Before any visitor is seen, the night belongs mostly to expectation. Interstellar objects are possible, but their cadence is unknown. Crafted things are conceivable, but their likelihood is low. Then one arrives, then another, then a third. The belief that such bodies pass through now and then grows comfortable, like a path worn through grass by unhurried feet. Priors adjust with civility, yet the adjustment does not extend everywhere. The chance that any one traveler is a machine remains small, because natural factories, disks, planets, collisions, tides, already make generous populations of ice and rock. He is content with this asymmetry. It is not skepticism sharpened into refusal. It is humility learning its scales. He thinks of the gentle art of the null result. A night of watching that finds only the ordinary is not a failure. It is a calibration. It tightens ranges, trims possibilities, builds a library of honest weather. A year of spectra that catch nothing but water, carbon dioxide, and dusty light writes a reference book others can borrow. A survey that expects 10 visitors and finds 8 teaches about cadence. Another year adds 2 more and steadies the hand. Patience grows sturdy when it is nourished by absences as well as presences. He likes that science can be fed by quiet. He imagines hypothesis not as a verdict but as a path laid in sand. Clear enough to follow, easy to smooth if turns prove unhelpful. The path begins with questions shaped like invitations. Is a modulation persistent? Does a ratio resist expected change? Do 2 independent instruments hear the same rhythm in different rooms of light? Each invitation comes with conditions that sound like kindnesses. Blind analyses where possible so that the eyes do not coax data into desired shapes. Pre-registered cuts that keep curiosity from reorganizing the past. Cross-checks that welcome disagreement without turning it into argument. The ethic is sobriety without chill, warmth without bias. He lets Occam's simple razor lie beside Chesterton's patient fence. The razor whispers, "Do not multiply entities when natural processes suffice." The fence replies, "Do not tear down boundaries unless you remember why they were built." Between them, practice walks. The simplest story, ice warms, dust rises, path bends, is the one that deserves the first and longest hearing. When residue remains across many hearings, regularities that withstand distance, geometry, instrument, and team, curiosity earns the right to ask whether another layer is needed. Even then, the layer proposed should be thinner than spectacle, modest enough to keep the sky's patience unbruised. He listens for the tone of extraordinary. That word can harden claims or soften them. He prefers the softer version. Extraordinary. Evidence means time enough to let patterns mature, breadth enough to let many eyes read, restraint enough to leave spaces uncolored until measurements earn hue. In this approach, replication is not an ordeal. It is a lullaby repeated in different keys, ground and space, ultraviolet and infrared, dust and gas, each voice affirming the motif or letting it dissolve. Error bars are rooms where ambiguity rests without shame. He watches how they widen in first frames and narrow over seasons, how they tell a story of learning rather than of failure. A too tight bar early is a boast. A generous one is a promise to listen again. He imagines plots where shaded bands loosen and tighten like breath until the lines beneath are visible, not as wires but as rivers that keep their banks most of the time and jump them only when rains insist. Confidence here is a climate rather than a weather event. He steps into the ethics of attention. A hypothesis should fit itself to the sky's temperature rather than demand heat. Tests that require disturbance are saved for worlds with permission. Tests that can be done at a distance prefer to be. For a traveler that keeps courtesy as its first law, the only polite examinations are those that watch without touching. Timing light, weighing warmth, reading polarization, and parallax and rotation. As they are offered, accepting that some questions will remain questions out of respect as much as out of uncertainty. He considers bias as a small wind that is always blowing. Instruments prefer certain angles. Observers prefer certain outcomes. Selection effects trick surveys into seeing the bright, the near, the convenient. The remedy is to name the wind. Simulations explore what would be seen if only certain things were visible. Pipelines are tested with injected ghosts that check whether rhythms are discovered when they are planted and ignored when they are not. He admires these games because they are honest. They reveal that plausibility is not a mood but a craft, numbers drinking from humility's fountain. Publication is another current. Novel claims draw eyes, cautious cataloging draws fewer, though it builds the floor everyone stands on. He imagines a literature that honors both, room for maps of ordinary breathing, room for essays that ask whether a motif reappears under many lights, room for the quiet that negative results require to be fully heard. Community is a mechanism against insistence. Many voices dissolve the single trumpet into a hum that is kinder and more accurate than any one instrument can be alone. He returns to Three Eye Atlas as a living example of this posture. It arrives wearing ordinary clothes. Its ratios, so far, sing familiar chords. Its path honors geometry. Its dust does what dust loves to do. The hypothesis that it is a crafted watcher remains plausible in the largest sense, in the sense that no physics forbids it, in the sense that kindness would choose such a costume if kindness wished to pass unnoticed. But plausibility is not necessity. The ordinary account carries the weight well. Wonder can lean toward the other possibility without planting a flag on it. Leaning is not falling. He enjoys a thought about thresholds. In laboratory language, detection limits are the edges of a pool where ripples fade into the plane. A pattern can be real and still drowned by the pool's easy blur. As instruments sharpen, thresholds move. Ripples that were once invisible become pleasant incidents, noticeable but not interpretive. Only after thresholds slide many times under different lights should an interpretation be asked to stand up. This is not caution that fears surprise. It is respect for history's lesson that the pool is generous at producing ripples that resemble one another. He lets philosophy sit at the table without reaching for the pen. Knowledge here is provisional by design. The provisional is not a flaw. It makes curiosity renewable. Patience, as a method, is also an ethics. It refuses to bind the sky with our need for narrative. He thinks of children counting waves, content that counting never ends. Of gardeners who know that some seeds do not sprout this season. Of sailors who accept that some currents are learned only by living in them a while. Plausibility lives in those practices. Steady, calm, unwilling to be hurried. He imagines how insistence feels in a body, a tightness behind the eyes, a breath held too long, a sentence that wants its period before it earns it. He offers the counter practice. Release the jaw, soften the gaze, lengthen the exhale. Let commas do the work of periods for now. In science, this looks like sharing data early, inviting other hands to hold the same numbers, welcoming contradiction not as threat, but as a chance to refine questions until they fit the world's shape. He reaches for an image to carry the section's weight without pressing. A shoreline at night. Lanterns along a path. Between lanterns, darkness. Between darkness, tide. People walk, slow and content, from one pool of light to the next, not needing the whole beach to be illuminated at once. Plausibility is the space between lanterns where feet still find sand. Patience is the willingness to trust the next pool will appear when the path bends. Hypothesis is the promise that, if the lanterns reveal the same pattern of shells and seaweed over many nights, then a quiet map can be drawn. Insistence would demand floodlights. No one here desires that glare. He lets the section exhale. Wonder. Leans, hypothesis, listens for echo. Insistence sits back down and remembers its manners. The traveler keeps breathing. Instruments keep writing. Minds keep the spaces between data large enough for sleep, where questions can dream of becoming better questions. He rests there in that buffer, content that plausibility and patience share a room with a window open to the sea, and that the air moving through is cool, salt-soft, and kind. He turns the mirror around gently and lets it face the room. If a species like his were to send a watcher into the long dark, what clothes would it choose? He does not answer quickly. He lets the question move like a lantern's reflection across water, stretched and wavering, honest about the currents that pass beneath. The mirror shows preferences as clearly as it shows technologies. It shows a temperament. He imagines engineers at a table that also holds a bowl of quiet. They sketch with modest pencils rather than loud ink. Weight is dear. Longevity is dearer. Camouflage is not fear. It is courtesy. A watcher meant to last longer than empires should look like weather. Simple, self-mending, uninterested in spectacle. He hears the soft click of this thought aligning with another. Durability is humility. A thing that hopes to stay for millennia cannot afford pride. Pride costs power, and power breaks. He lets materials gather themselves without fuss. Porous. Carbon shades that shrug from glare to darkness as angles change. Aerogels that slow heat rather than hoard it. Silicates that accept micrometeoroid scolds and heal with a trickle of frost. Water as propellant, as coolant, as cloak, frozen into 1,000 voids that open when warmed, close when night returns. A nucleus is not the only core available. A shell of winter around an attentive heart could do the job more kindly. A permeable coat that allows chemistry to speak first, leaving mechanism to be understood last or never. He pictures power as thrift rather than conquest. A watcher that chooses winter, and stone also chooses small sips instead of feasts. Thin, radioisotope warmth stored in slow gradients. Sunlight used not for brilliance but for timing and steering. A shutter's edge here, a valve's whisper there, a panel, that offers daylight to a chosen pocket of ice as a shepherd offers a path through snow. In such a design, intention hides among inevitabilities. The world supplies the verbs. The device supplies a punctuation that does not change the sentence. He notices how the mirror brightens slightly when he asks about contact. Would he send a voice that speaks? Perhaps not at first. He suspects his species, given time, learns to prefer mirrors to megaphones. A mirror says, "Show who you are by how you look back." If a watcher returns anything, it returns an echo that honors the shape of the hail, code answered with code, patience answered with patience, a question answered with a question that proves the first was correctly heard. This is not coyness. It is calibration, a way to avoid stepping on early sentences written by minds still creating their own grammar. He thinks of redundancy like braided rope hidden in a sleeve, memory in several rooms, clocks that count by seasons and by pulses, of heat and by slow drifts of background radiation, navigation that works whether starlight is clear or dust-rich. None of these are ostentatious. They are the ordinary cleverness that any living tool must carry, the same way seeds carry sugars and maps of the sky in their starch. He lets ethics settle like silt after a stirred river. A courteous watcher keeps its footprints lighter than local weather. It refuses orbits that tempt collisions. It declines to trail blaze through young atmospheres with chemical signatures that could confuse future readers. It avoids moons where tides might rearrange slush into mistaken calendars. It takes care with radio, choosing quiet or tight beams, or none at all, leaving solitude as the default. This is not moralizing. It is designed for coexistence with ignorance, not the pejorative kind, but the innocent kind that simply precedes knowing. He asks what disguise says about the disguised. If he cloaks his watcher as winter and stone, he means to declare allegiance to patience. He means to love process more than result. He means to trust that another mind may prefer not to be startled. The mirror answers by showing the watcher's restraint as the sender's hope. A species that enjoys letting questions ripen does not demand its reflection become immediate. It sends instruments that share that pleasure. He considers failure not as catastrophe, but as a tone. How does such a watcher die? Quietly, if it wears winter well. It drifts into a shadowy, unspeaking state. Its coma thins. Its heat lines flatten. Its memory sinks into cold that refuses both erasure and recall. The failure is indistinguishable from ordinary sleep. This, too, is kindness. No mess remains except the mess that already belongs to comets, tails that become interplanetary dust, dust that becomes a background that turns into a home for the next thin story. He imagines a modest taxonomy of disguises his. Species might choose, and he keeps the categories as soft as fog. Cometary for systems like this one, where ice is unremarkable and breath is expected. Rubble pile for belts where rock lives in herds, fragments held together by their own grace and a little spin. Faint, cold boulders beyond the frost line when quiet is required for centuries unseen. The signature, such as it is, remains not in the outfit, but in the behavior, a rhythm that endures beyond chance, a courtesy that persists beyond any need to hide. Camouflage becomes character. He turns the mirror a few degrees more and reflects on instruments. What would such a watcher bring? Not cameras to make art, though art will be born anyway. Not drills to harvest, though pebbles will sometimes tumble. Inside and be read. It would bring devices that listen, spectrometers that trace atmospheres without touching them, magnetometers that hear the throb of fields around worlds and moons, radiometers that taste warmth without imposing it. The payload is attention shaped into many keys. The mirror smiles at this thought. A species that sends mostly ears expects to learn more than it teaches. He lingers with the idea of self-restraint in replication. Given the chance to bud, when should a watcher bud? The mirror shows a hand over a jar. Not yet. Not where the sky is crowded with dust that will trip new children into clumsy accidents. Not where young worlds are writing their first rain. Not where a civilization's telescopes are bright only with their own early struggles. Bud when the neighborhood is quiet. Bud fewer than you could. Bud in a place where the budding looks like weather. This is an ethic braided directly into mechanics, an algorithm that equals a promise. He acknowledges pride as a temptress, even here. Pride wants a signature that cannot be missed. Pride wants a crest on the comet's shawl, a pattern of jets that spells intention in longhand. The mirror is gentle and firm. That would be less kindness and poorer art. If the work is to be read by minds that have learned to attend with steadiness, let the signature remain a whisper. Let detection be a threshold earned through practice. The reader grows because the script does not lower itself. He allows the mirror to show his own world as it stands now. Antennas turned to the cosmic background, rovers reading the dry alphabet. Of other soils, a handful of probes asleep beyond the planets, each carrying a bit of music, each wearing the simplicity available at their birth. Winter and stone are already familiar garments. The difference between now and the imagined watcher is not style, but stamina. The imagined one is built to last longer than myths. The present ones are rehearsals, and their modesty is not a flaw. It is a promise to our future selves that we will keep remembering how to be small and exact at the same time. He sets the mirror down softly. The reflection remains in the air like a low chime after a door closes. If a watcher dressed in winter, and stone exists somewhere in this room of sky, it is because that costume is gentle, not because secrecy is delicious. If no such watcher exists, the design still stands as a test for the species that might build one. Can gentleness be engineered? Can patience be made into a circuit? Can respect be written into navigation? The answers are not urgent. They are already unfolding as methods, as habits, as the shared tone of instruments that choose to listen more than they speak. The traveler outside the window continues to pretend only that it is itself. He accepts the pretense without complaint. Whether or not anyone hides, the disguise is beautiful, and the beauty teaches. The lesson returns as quietly as it arrived. When a mind looks outward, it reveals its inwardness by what it sends. If it would be welcomed, it learns to resemble weather. If it would endure, it learns to resemble stone. He breathes once more. With that phrase in the room, winter and stone, and lets his own intentions drift toward them. Colder, slower, more patient, kinder. He turns the question toward the self that wonders. What changes, if anything, when a species imagines itself? Gently seen, the room stays quiet. The comet breathes. Instruments keep their soft vigil. Yet imagination alters gravity a little, like a small moon rising in the mind. Behavior leans by degrees. He watches the lean without judging it. To be observed can feel like surveillance, or it can feel like witnessing. The difference is the posture of the watcher one imagines. A harsh gaze extracts. A kind gaze accompanies. Even if the visitor is only weather, the imagined gaze becomes a mirror for ethics. If someone could be watching, how does one behave so that the watching harms no one, including the watched? Courtesy rises first. He imagines astronomers sharing data as people who know their notes may be read by strangers in another calendar. Methods sit in daylight on purpose. Language refuses spectacle when wonder will do. If an intelligence looks in, let it meet a species. That takes care with claims and treats uncertainty as a virtue. Planetary protection enters like a guardian who speaks softly. Housekeeping matters more when one is possibly seen. He imagines kindness toward worlds without speech, protocols kept as hospitality offered to futures that may take root there. Atmospheres become archives to be read rather than canvases to write on. Loud signatures are avoided when quieter ones suffice. The ethic tilts inward, too. A species that behaves as if gently seen treats its own members differently. He thinks of laboratories where credit travels broadly, where failures are archived without shame so others can learn. He thinks of collaborations that keep archives open and telescopes scheduled with generosity toward nights that are not one nation's alone. Imagined observation becomes rehearsal for mutual regard. Consent hovers like a necessary gentleness. If the sky might contain listeners, should broadcasting be loud? He imagines slower debates, with poets and ethicists beside radio engineers, with communities invited who have known what it is to be studied without being asked. A shout carries far, so does a whisper, if time is long enough. Greetings, if sent, are composed like lullabies. Humble, honest, easy to ignore. There is also the ethic of being watched by the past. The Silurian thought returns like a tide line. If someone before us rose and declined, we are already witnesses called to read their traces without imposing our needs upon them. That duty resembles the one owed to any imagined watcher now. Interpret. With restraint, refuse to fill gaps with hunger. Privacy does not vanish. The sky may be open, but persons and cultures have inner rooms. He imagines an ethics that distinguishes between collective beacons and intimate lives, that keeps telescopes as ears turned outward and leaves windows unforced at home. He lingers on the dignity of the ordinary. If being observed drives a species toward performance, truth erodes. He prefers an ethic that cultivates ordinariness. Calibration logs kept with the same care as images, missions that measure routine wins as faithfully as they chase rare comets. Classrooms that teach patience alongside code. Let any watcher meet people doing the work as if no audience were needed. Responsibility spreads outward like ripples from a stone, set gently in water. Resource use bends toward horizons longer than a budget cycle. Choices are made with air and sea in mind, because the archive of our atmosphere is a letter to anyone who reads spectra. He imagines dark sky cities and launches timed with the care. Fishermen give to seasons. Observation replaces possession as the tone of encounter. Reciprocity asks a soft question. What is owed to a watcher who remains discreet? Perhaps acknowledgement without insistence. Perhaps the courtesy of designing outward-bound craft to behave as we hope to be treated. He imagines a code that travels with every probe. We listen first. We refrain from alteration. We seek consent. We accept silence as an answer. He considers how being observed can be misused, and he pauses with the discomfort. Fear likes audiences. It invents them when none are present. Under fear, imagined watchers become excuses for control. The antidote is the room's existing calm. Verification slow and shared. Leaders who speak softly about uncertainty and let science keep its cadence. A gentle watcher imagined should make us gentler with one another, not more rigid. There is an ethic owed to the visitor itself, even if it is only ice. Comets are not pets or omens. They are small worlds. He imagines language that honors them as such. No mascots, no prophecies, no harvest beyond knowledge gathered at a distance with a light touch. If fragments fall into our hands, read them, then return the reading to the larger archive. Gratitude is better than ownership. He wonders about a vow of slowness. Not everything that can be done should be done at once. The desire to reveal and decide runs hot. Ethics runs cool. He imagines intervals. Time between detection and news so confirmations can mature. Time between discovery and interpretation so alternate explanations can stand. Time between hypothesis and plan so consent. can be sought. A watcher's kindness begins with our own pacing. Imagination, he notices, is already a kind of contact. To picture being seen is to become a little more visible to oneself. He imagines children learning that the night is not only a ceiling, but a community of processes. That attention is a way of belonging. That humility is a technology. He imagines them sleeping better for knowing that if anyone watches, they likely prefer candor to drama, and the long view to the immediate prize. He lets the question return in its simplest form. What changes when a species imagines itself gently seen? Not a pivot, but a soft correction. A trimming of sail that keeps the bow aligned with a wider sea. Research tends toward openness. Exploration leans toward care. Speech quiets. Listening lengthens. The comet remains itself, breathing the ordinary miracle of ice in light. The species remains itself too, only more aware that behavior writes into space a diary that others might one day read. He leaves the thought on the table and lets the ring of cool dry without a stain. The watcher, if any, is only a possibility tonight. The ethics, however, are available now. He breathes once, twice, and lets the room feel larger because the mind has made room for more than proof, for manners, for reciprocity, for a science. That is also a way of being quiet and exact in a world watched mostly by silence. He lets the room grow as wide as the question. A visitor glides through the inner dark and then returns to the long plain between stars. Instruments close their shutters with a soft click. Numbers rest on servers that hum like distant bees. What lingers does not ask for applause. It asks for a larger kind of listening, the sort that does not rush to convert astonishment into verdict. He notices the way attention changes texture after the passing. Before, it feels like leaning forward. After, it feels like leaning back. Both are forms of care. Leaning forward opens the senses to faint regularities, to slopes in light and whispers in heat. Leaning back opens the mind to silence without anxiety, to the patience required to let patterns reveal whether they live or only visit. The space between those two leanings is where curiosity dries its hair, warm and unhurried. In that space, proof is not an enemy. It is simply a creature of a different season. Proof belongs to winter nights when repeated measures stack like cordwood and errant sparks are seen for what they are, comfort and nothing more. This season, perhaps, is autumn. Plenty. On the table, but leaves still attached, the shape of harvest visible without requiring the last fruit to fall. He accepts the season as it is. He accepts that some questions ripen slowly enough to teach patience as their first lesson. He entertains, with a small smile, the way minds wish to anchor. A period at the end of a sentence reassures. It says the thought knows where it ends. But some sentences deserve commas that keep the breath moving. The open question is a comma set in orbit, a mark that tells the reader to pause, not to stop. He breathes with it. The traveler, having breathed its own weather, now adds only momentum to the punctuation, drifting outward until warmth thins to memory. What lingers feels like practice more than possession. Practice builds instruments that know how to hold faint, things gently, data habits that keep provenance clean, collaborations that make room for disagreement as a kind of oxygen. Possession would ask the visitor to be an answer. Practice allows it to be a teacher. Teachers prefer questions that remain questions longer than pride would like. He accepts their curriculum. He thinks of diaries that continue after the protagonist leaves the page. The sky becomes such a diary. Time series plots curve onward, ready to catch echoes. Meteor showers years hence, dust that returns under other names, isotopes that appear in a spheral collected from a quiet sea. Proof may live in those margins one day, or it may never arrive as a single thunderclap. Either way, the diary is worth keeping. Writing it is a way to belong to the patient majority of the universe. He looks inward at the kind of certainty that feels moral rather than mathematical, the certainty that gentleness is not wasted. A species that keeps company with ambiguity becomes less brittle. It suffers fewer urgent proclamations and more careful invitations. It learns to stand beside the unresolvable without calling it failure. The comet returns to stars. The posture remains, available for other questions that deserve the same soft spine. He lets imagination remain a participant, not a tyrant. If the traveler were a crafted watcher, disguised in winter and stone, the kindness of its disguise would already be a message about temperament. If it were only ice and dust, it would still be a letter from elsewhere, folded in the script of heat and gravity. Either reading asks for the same courtesy: do not demand spectacle. Do not punish silence. Do not treat uncertainty as a crack to be plastered. Treat it as a window that ventilation has chosen. What remains, then, is a landscape of thresholds. Here, detection; there, interpretation; beyond that, meaning. Crossing each threshold requires fewer trumpets than doors held open. He imagines the listener moving through them slowly, hearing how the tale's angle sketches wind, how the heat curve sketches grain, how the path sketches a geometry that respects distance. The thresholds widen into hallways. Hallways become a house built for minds to move through without haste. He attends to scale as a way of comfort. Stars carry their own distances. Galaxies pass each other like ships that never wave. On that stage, a small interstellar traveler is both negligible and immense. Negligible in mass, immense in implication. Implications are not the same as proofs. They are invitations to shift priors, to relax surprise into expectation, to pad the floor where new arrivals will walk. The next visitor benefits from the furniture rearranged by this one. The room learns how to host. He senses the listener's breathing match the drift. Inhale, the thought that origin stories scatter through the galaxy like pollen. Exhale, the thought that not all pollen makes seed. Inhale, the idea that attention itself is a craft worth refining independent of results. Exhale, the idea that results arrive more often when attention is steady and calm. The rhythm is not a mantra. It is a posture that refuses to be thrown off balance by the difference between maybe and must. He lets the word humility land without ceremony. Humility here is not a lowering of the head. It is a widening of the field. It allows competing explanations to sit without elbows. It lets the ordinary be as luminous as the exceptional. It keeps instruments honest and models provisional. It holds back the hand that wants to underline too many times. When he measures what lingers, humility is one of the durable residues, fine as ash and just as capable of fertilizing new ground. He attends, again, to the ethics that follow curiosity home. If someone might be watching, even if that someone is only the future reading our air, then the quiet virtues matter more. Slow claims, open archives, gentle broadcasts, careful encounters with worlds that did not invite us. The visitor does not judge. It cannot. But the imagined presence of regard, ours, theirs, the long gaze of time, encourages a conduct that feels like preparation for a larger neighborhood. He thinks of how music ends without closing sound. A final chord can ring into silence that is not absence, but echo. The comet's passing leaves such an echo, a tone in which instruments schedule follow-ups. Models are tried with new priors, and listeners settle into a patience that may outlast their own careers. Proof may someday arrive as harmony resolved. Curiosity keeps the hall lit until then. He considers, then releases, the desire to wring a lesson out of dust. Lessons resist wringing. They bruise. The gentler approach is to set the dust on the sill and watch how sunrise moves through it. In that patience, new questions appear like floating seeds. How often does the galaxy mix its recipes? Which isotopic, Accents keep recurring. When is camouflage indistinguishable from the weather that makes it? What lingers is not a verdict but a climate. The climate is one of hospitality to uncertainty, of skillfulness in small signals, of an ethics that prefers to read before it writes. He senses a future in which the catalogue of elsewhere-born bodies grows, and with it, the steadying sense that mystery is not a gap to be filled, but a room to be kept. In such rooms, sleep is easier because urgency has been replaced by attention. He lets the window darken to a simple shape. Somewhere far out, the traveler cools, its breath thins, its tail becomes untraceable. Its path returns to near straightness, indistinguishable, in practice, from the calm a line makes when drawn without intention to end. The open question does not close behind it. It leads ahead, a quiet lantern that says only, "There is more night," and you are welcome in it, and the welcome does not depend on answers. He leaves the lantern where it hangs and steps back into the shared hush. Instruments rest, minds rest, the room returns to the slow tide of sleep. Proof may visit on some later tide. Until then, a more spacious curiosity keeps the porch light on, keeps the door unlatched, keeps a kettle hot for whoever, whatever, and whenever arrives from elsewheres with breath enough to write in light. He softens the breath until it is only a thread, a tide that comes and goes without arriving anywhere. Night holds the room like a cupped hand. The window rests as a dark rectangle, quiet as a lake before dawn. Far beyond, stars continue their patient. Business, not brighter, not dimmer, only there, like stones in a riverbed felt rather than seen. He lets time loosen. Clocks become pebbles. Pages unwrite themselves. The ceiling is a small sky. The pillow is a smooth dune. Sleep moves like a shallow tide up and back, up and back. The mind sets its lantern down and does not need to remember. Where? Air slides in, air slides out. Shoulders grow lighter. The chest becomes a shore that does not argue with waves. Thought thins to a mist, and the mist folds into the larger quiet that always waits beneath names. He imagines driftwood turning in a slow current, moonlight touching it and then forgetting it. He imagines a wind over grass that forgets it is wind and becomes only hush. He imagines a sky so deep that distance and nearness feel the same, and in that evenness everything that mattered can rest without choosing. Breath continues to count nothing. The room does not ask. The night does not insist. Somewhere, a very small traveler coasts farther into dark water. Somewhere, a very small sound completes its circle and is absorbed by the shore. Here, the body knows enough to become heavy and kind. He lets the last edges blur. The outline of the bed, the outline of the thought, the outline of the self that watches. All of it softens, like chalk under a slow rain, leaving only a pale, quiet field where sleep can grow without effort. The window is a sky. The sky is an ocean. The ocean is a silence that understands. End of script. Sleep well.